It's like my wife's alarm clock. I mean, she wakes up really early. Okay, it's a phone.
Microphone's
works.
on. Okay. Is it live? Yes. Okay, great. Good. It's live. Good morning, everyone. It's Sunday morning at the Helsinki Security Forum, which means it's time for the Russia panel. I've sat on in mild irritation over the last 2 days as all the other panels have talked about Russia. This is where we actually are just talking only about Russia. I'm very blessed to have a fantastic panel of experts who know this topic better than anyone. Mikko, Hautala, it's great to see you. Last time we saw each other in Moscow, of course, the former Finnish ambassador to Russia and Washington. Arkady Moshes is the program director here at FIIA, and the wonderful Katri Pynnöniemi is associate professor at the National Defense University and the University of Helsinki. Mikko, you've literally just written the book on this topic. So if you don't mind, could you set us up this morning by talking about how you see the Russian aspect in European security? Factor, not aspect, factor.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's I get a kind of a small holiday from my unpacking my packages because we just received 165 boxes of things, and this is a perfect excuse to spend a couple of hours elsewhere than unpacking those things. On Russia, so yes, I've written a book which comes out now in October, and mainly I try to assess and kind of with the benefit of kind of after wisdom understand why it all went the way it went, and also I give a kind of a prognosis on the future. Basically, what I see right now is that this conflict is going to continue. Most likely it's going to get even deeper, and it's going to be even harder to solve this than we used to think. So my kind of assessment is fairly gloomy and negative, and I'm not a negative guy myself, but I think the facts simply are what they are.
Arkady, I know that you have also a pretty grim view of what is going to come next, or at least how Europe has assessed this factor. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure, and I will also start by thanking the organizers for having me here. I spoke here 2 years ago, and yes, today my view is somewhat gloomier. I'll come to details maybe, but I need certainly a little bit more time to explain my views. And I will start with a banality. Banality is bad in many respects except one. It's usually correct. And the banality is that we know what is the role of Russia in today's European security system. It's a role of a challenger, outside challenger. It's a role of the revisionist power. Russia wants to revise everything that has been done since '91. It wants to replay the end of the Cold War. That's why I still think there is a difference between what it is doing in Ukraine and what it could potentially be doing vis-a-vis NATO and the members of the European Union, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it's a revisionist power that tells it all. But now I end with the banalities and want to offer something else, something probably new to most of the people. We finally have to realize that the European security system, for the first time in history, at least in the last 325 years, will be built against Russia. The mantra that we've been hearing from essentially '93, that no, it's not against Russia, it's for something else, it might be correct, or might have been correct when it was first invented, but at the moment it's pretty clear that this system will be built against Russia, and I'll explain why. And first I'll put my historian's hat, which is a little bit dusty but always ready to be worn, and explain why I think it's for the first time in history. Because at least starting from the Northern War, Russia, Soviet Union, were just part of the European system of alliances and coalitions, which were fluid, which were flexible, which were done and undone very often. There was very little structural in that sense. But that lasted all the way through the Cold War. I'll come to the Cold War in a second, because that's a special period, obviously. But before that, Russia was part of many European alliances and coalitions. A fun fact is that Russia's biggest military victories were achieved when Russia was an ally to Britain. The biggest are Napoleon and Second World War, and almost it could be there during the First World War. And Russia's most shameful defeats were the wars in which Britain was in a different alliance. And I'm not even talking about the Crimean War. My favorite is, in that sense, the Russian-Japanese War. Not many people know, but Britain and Japan were military allies already from 1902 to 1921. And there was, anyway, but I won't, if you want to know more, ask me or open Wikipedia. But it's just a fun fact. Cold War, Soviet Union was still part of a coalition. Of course, the members of the coalition were not necessarily joining it voluntarily, but they were there. There was a Western coalition, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and of course there were in relations of a confrontation, but it was like going down from, I'd say, 62 Caribbean crisis towards the issues of arms control, towards the Helsinki meeting of 75, emergence of the CSCE at that time, later growing into OSCE. So there was a confrontation, but in order to manage that confrontation, the sides agreed to have first the conference, then an organization which could help. And it did play its positive role, and we should not forget about that. Now it's completely different, but there was a period when this is how it worked, stabilizing the system. That system started to unravel as the Soviet Union was about to collapse. For me, it started to unravel in 1988, when Gorbachev announced the unilateral withdrawals of 500,000 of Russian troops from Europe. Before that, in my dissertation, which was defended in '92, I had to study such a thing as the one called MBFR, Mutual Balanced Force Reductions, when a delegation after delegation were meeting in Vienna for a decade or so, talking about one division size cuts of the military forces. I mean, it's amazing how they could be talking about 8 to 12,000 for years, couldn't find the formula, and then Gorbachev came and said, we're just withdrawing 500,000. And that's when it started, and in '93, with the beginning of the first conversations about the NATO enlargement, it ended. But that's when we got the mantra that this is not against Russia. Okay. So what has changed? I don't need to tell you what has changed now. Russia is doing what it is doing. And in fact, I'm trying to explain the logic. Russia and the West are in a confrontational relationship at the moment. If you look at the energy, which used to be the backbone of the kind of cooperation, it's gone. When you talk about the economic relationship, well, when one side imposes sanctions on the other side, that is about inflicting damage, that is about an economic war. And rightly so, because the rationale is understandable. The relationship between the two countries, two societies, or relationship with the Russian people are also getting more and more problematic. The Finnish border, which has stayed closed for now 9 months or 10 months, is an example of that. That's the border which at the peak, 1913, saw 12 million crossings. 12 million, talking about people-to-people relations, this is what it was. It's now closed, and very few people talk about it. Those who need to travel to Russia still find a way to travel. It's a torture, but they do it. But that's symbolic. So economic war, isolation of societies, or wall growing between the societies. And the only bastion still standing is the Western inability to say that they're also, in the military sense, in a confrontation with Russia. Every time somebody is talking about this, he or she gets reprimanded. That this is considered to be a stabilizing factor, not to talk about that. I think it's wrong. I think that sooner or later, it will still be moving in that direction. Why has not it been done so far? And this is where I have to say 2 years ago I was more optimistic, because 2 years ago I thought that the way out by means of freezing the conflict and paying with Ukrainian lands for another armistice with Russia had been stayed behind. That paradigm had been left behind by the people. It wasn't. Now, 2 years later, we are again talking about that there needs to be a peaceful peace or ceasefire negotiations, which means like pressurizing Ukraine to make concessions. This is legally impossible, as those who read my article in Helsinki and Sanomat can understand why. But I mean, we still get in the mantra that the new European security system will not be built against Russia. It will. I'm coming to my last point, and which is a little bit paradoxical. It will be built against Russia, whatever happens in Ukraine. Because if Ukraine prevails on the battlefield and the formula is found, the West will immediately have to start preparing for the new round of hostilities sometime down the road when Russia is ready for that. Russia will not accept it for a long term if it's defeated in Ukraine. But if it wins in Ukraine, as I said, I'm not that sure that it will be willing to attack NATO countries or have the war with them, because again, what I said in the beginning, Russia's goal is replaying the results of the Cold War, getting the veto powers in the European security, getting the monopoly rights in the post-Soviet space, but not necessarily going into war with the whole West. But whatever will be the goals of Russia, the West will have to treat them as inimical, dictated by inimical intentions. And so that's basically where I have to finish. Whatever is going to happen, the next European system will be built against Russia.
Thank you. That was deeply gloomy. If anyone else has a favorite war, feel free to say it. Katri, obviously we shouldn't joke about this stuff, but I mean, one note to take out of what Arkady just said there is that there is still naivety in the West. That we're not able to call a spade when it comes to Russia's full role in European security. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think it is. And it's very sad to see it after 2 years, that there are still this, that we are in a way talking about Russia of future rather than focusing on what exactly Russia is right now.
Yeah.
So I would like to put on the table, I very much agree what was said before, but you remember 1992, Alexander Wendt wrote a famous article, Anarchy is what states make of it. So we could apply this, that Russia is what we make of it. And what I mean that all these different Russias that are present today will be only reinforced if we don't deal with each of them. For example, if we accept the shadow fleet as a matter of fact, we will have more of this gray zone economic stuff that maybe benefit one company here, one country there, and then is undermine the whole economic system. And then the sabotage and killings and all that kind of stuff that is being sold in social platforms and in any other places. This is part of Russia's sort of new way of warfare, and I understand that it's difficult to attribute it. But still, we can't just say that, well, it is difficult to attribute it, let's deal with it later. No, we will have more of it. And then finally, if we allow a reality that we have today, that every day Russia is terror bombing Ukrainian cities, like following citizens in Kherson and killing them by drones. I mean, this is Russia that we have and we will have, unless, I think it's kind of normative position that Arkady was explaining, that we will have this European security system against Russia, but we would need it right now to make a different type of future for Ukraine and for Europe. But Russia is so good at playing with the fears, playing with the interests that we can say that, well, because Ukraine is not part of the European Union and, well, there are these difficulties of getting Russia Ukraine into NATO, therefore, and because of the escalation possibilities. But I think we just could do more, and then there could be maybe a different kind of Russia. So I'm in a way also against this idea of that there's only one path for Russia. Right now we can kind of show document by document that there really is this idea of imperialism and different type of worldview that we wouldn't like to see in Russia. And it is really influencing decisions. But it's not the only future possibility.
I can't help but think, though, that we keep describing Russia as the actor and us as the respondent, rather than actually like, there's a lot of us. You know?
Yeah, I think
why
that's
are
the
we
whole
not the
problem.
ones setting the agenda here?
First of all, I think one of the key factors here are the nuclear weapons that we quite often tend to forget.
We forget that we have them.
Yes, well, we also have them, but I think the real problem here is that if you really start to think over different ways to handle this conflict and even prevail over Russia, I think the fundamental kind of assessment in the West is that where does that lead us at the end of the day? So if you conventionally beat the Russians, theoretically you could do so, then what? What would be the response? And this is the reason why I think the US leadership, most leaders in the West, they're kind of, it leads them to think this conflict in a rather, not only gloomy, but in a mixed way, because you certainly have political needs to prevail and help Ukraine and make sure that it wins. But at the same time, you have these secondary aspects that you really have to take seriously. So that's one thing. I think commenting on what Arkady said, I fully agree with his overall thinking. This is going to be our future system against Russia, rather than it being part of the team who somehow builds it. But I fundamentally do still expect that the idea of conflict between Russia and NATO, I don't see, like Arkady said, I don't see Russia trying to challenge NATO kind of in a vacuum, in a situation where you don't have conflicts elsewhere. But what I do see a real danger is a situation when, let's say, US is busy in the Indo-Pacific. It's going to be probably a bit more busy in the Middle East. So if you have a multitude of conflicts elsewhere, that will drain US resources, and US resources are pretty much what we have in real sense. That's the situation when Russian thinking might also be adjusted, and the sort of the appetite might grow. So I don't fully or completely kind of take it out of the picture, and I think this is actually something we should be prepared for.
And this new security architecture that we're building, in Arkady's argument, against Russia directly, what does it look like? How does it look any different from what we have right now?
It will take time, because the major problem, nuclear weapons is certainly a big issue, and there are some other issues. But I think the biggest problem is politics and psychology. Psychology of the Western leaders, which time after time choose the path dependence way. They still hope that somehow they will be able to overweight Putin. There will be somebody else there. The situation will change. There might be a new Gorbachev. There might be all sorts of wishful thinking, which is not based on anything. So this psychological problem is one, and politics is the other. Because if you seriously think that time has come to build a system against Russia, you need to start spending a lot more money on the military. You have to, in many countries, restart or restore the system of conscription, because otherwise you won't be able to do it. So this is why you get this hope. I mean, the politics is built in hope that somehow in 23, in 24, the war will end somehow. And unfortunately, as I said, the expectations that it will end somehow at the expense of Ukraine are no longer shocking. I mean, when you talk to a lot of people, this is what they expect. This is the expected behavior of the West to betray Ukraine, to kind of, when I was talking about Russia trying to replay the end of the Cold War, that's exactly the point. It's not about defeating the West. It's about getting a priority rights in a certain region to which Ukraine used to belong. It does not anymore, but I mean, not everybody in Kremlin has been reading recent articles. But that's the problem. The problem is psychology, the problem is the economy, the problem is politics.
Katri, do you sense that there's any kind of shift in these last 2 years? You know, as we've talked about the situation looking grimmer than it was 2 years ago, do you notice a shift in European capitals that they recognize that we are moving towards a better mindset where what Arkady's just talked about could actually come to pass?
Well, I mostly focus on what's going on in the Russian side, but I think there is this this sort of need to get something completed, and then we get into the trouble of these discussions being like too vague. What we mean by winning and losing, and then again Russians define strategic defeat in a way that scares everybody, and then people put on the table the nuclear weapons, and okay, what exactly then do we mean by that? Because I think a lot of the military analysts are saying that it wouldn't really serve Russia anyhow to use the nukes, but it does serve to scare people with this. But of course, here we are with in the area where actual knowledge is very, very precious. So, but I think there were really lot of hopes in last summer with the counter-offensive in Ukraine, and now again we've been through a summer which is like opposite to that, very gloomy, and the situation is super gloomy right now, and the coming winter in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So, and then on the other hand, there is this election factor that seems to get into the calculations as well.
The election factor?
I mean the US elections,
yes,
as if it would then become a kind of turning point to somewhere that we really don't know where.
Mikko, you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, I think the reason why the Europeans are, especially the Europeans, are kind of divided on how to respond, I think it's very simple actually. Most of the countries in the EU are far away from Russian borders. They will never feel the same kind of anxiety, risk, or threat, and they will spend consequently much less. And it's going to be very hard and next to impossible to somehow make them spend more, make them really not only spend more, because you can spend money on salaries, you can spend money on military pensions, but to really invest and really sort of conscript people. So I think that's going to be, we have to be realistic about this. I mean, all the seminars I attend, they always come up with the same kind of an idea that we should spend more, everybody has to be there. But I don't think we're going to see everybody there, because the difference between this threat, and like Arkady said, I think quite convincingly that Russia is mostly trying to kind of reconvene the veto power over the former Soviet Union territory. This is not the same kind of threat like communism was.
Yeah.
It's not a kind of total, everything encompassing threat. So that's the reason why it's going to be uneven response by us. Obviously, countries like Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, that do have the common border, that do really sense and understand the consequences of a failed defensive war by Ukraine. I think you don't have to convince us. Our problem is how to convince, let's say, I don't want to name any countries, but let's say Portuguese. You really have to get gloomy to expect that you're going to see Russian tanks at the border between Portugal and Spain. So that's our fundamental problem.
Because they know France would stop them.
Yes, I think they expect that.
I wanted to ask you about the US in particular. I mean, a lot of, we talk about the Cold War, etc. US resolve in Europe was key to that. The US has played a big role in the war in Ukraine. A lot of people, I think, in this room would argue a negative one. Salami slice tactics, slow walking weapons, slow walking approvals. Is that another aspect that we're not talking about enough? That US resolve to stand up to Russia in Europe has decreased, and so Europe is not moving as fast as it should?
I think your assessment is completely right. And just coming back from the US, I think what we tend to underestimate here in Europe is that the US total focus on China.
Yeah.
And because they see China as the main threat, as the real peer competitor, so it's consequently they will place most of the resources against that threat. So regardless of who wins in the elections, I believe the US will have to follow that course, and it means that the Europeans, no matter who explains it to us, we have to pay more, we have to get serious about this. But then again, like I said before, we're going to face the problem of uneven threat perception, and that's going to be a dividing aspect for the European politics. And let me simply remind us that actually during the peak of the Cold War 40 years ago, the NATO average spending on defense was close to 4%. And the US was, of course, far beyond that, roughly around 6%, because they had global responsibilities. But I think the Europeans we are still far behind what we have to do in total numbers.
And in many ways, 2% has become almost a problem, because people say, no, I'm doing 2%, and 2% doesn't really get us anywhere. Yeah. I want to talk a bit about, there's an excellent paper written by Sinikukka and Jussi, head of this panel, to which I'm eternally grateful. It's not just about the military aspect of what Russia's doing in security, it's also a more medium-term kind of psychological thing here about values, principles. We've referred to them a little bit. I mean, Putin must already feel like he's accomplished a lot of what he set out to do, given 2008, given 2014, now 2024, we're talking about peace deal in Ukraine that wouldn't give Ukraine back all of its territory. I mean, have we already lost in terms of defending those values? And do you think, Katri, do you think Putin thinks he's already won?
Well, that's a kind of difficult question again, how we define winning. I mean, for the current Kremlin, it is enough to continue legitimizing, in a way, creating an impression that Russia has a legitimate right for expansion. Mm-hmm. So all kind of narratives that fit into this idea that Russia is saving people, and then Ukraine is a artificial country victim of the West is actually attacking Russia via Ukraine. All this kind of nonsense, and then delegitimizing the resistance in different forms. So it's not just what's happening in the war or around the war, but it's also what's happening in the different international organizations. Yeah. And there I would kind of say that it is should be in the interest of all European countries that how we let one big country with nuclear weapons to behave in international organizations and use them for purposes of legitimating this kind of war, or the idea that actually Russia should have a say on European security on the basis of its armed forces being able to take territories. I mean, that's all based on violence and basically fabrication of reality. So in that sense, what I call here is that we have to be very specific always when we talk about these issues. So I think that's a good argument in the paper.
And Arkady, you talked about Russia taking a space away from others and talking about legitimizing its place in places. I mean, we've allowed that to happen now. I mean, Putin is living rent-free in our heads, right? In terms of the fear factor. How do we change that?
that was or would be a totally correct description before February 22. And that's why, because he and people around him must have been totally certain that Europe would give up, exactly the way it had been giving up all the times before. I'm sure that this was a factor which affected seriously their thinking, and they went forward. But to be fair, I mean, what is done is maybe too little too late, but if you look at the last 2.5 years, pretty much has been done to show to Russia that the Western democracies can mobilize. Again, I would be happy to speak about the deficiencies in the approach, but quite a lot has been done. And even regarding the nuclear thing, well, I'm tempted to say that people who are drawing certain red lines are colorblind. But the point is that even regarding the nuclear, too many people talk about it, too many people are crying wolves. But I'm not sure that there is an actual preparation going on. Otherwise, we would already know from the American sources, probably. So there is a lot of do, but maybe about nothing. I am not saying that you have to just ignore the whole nuclear thing. It's impossible. But to base everything on the nuclear is wrong. Let me tell you again, give me one historical fact, especially because in the last couple of months, all the newspapers were writing about the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk region as the first time the Russian territory has been conquered, invaded No, it's just because we don't know history. The first time happened in January '69, when China sent troops to the island of Damansky. And there were serious battles there. And by the way, why nobody's talking about it? Because the Damansky is no longer under the Russian control. Putin gave it to the Chinese. The border was completely changed. The Chinese did it in '69. Of course, they have 5,000 years of history behind them. They can wait. They were waiting for another less than 30 years and got it. And the island of Damansky doesn't exist anymore. And a monument to Soviet soldiers, border guards, and normal infantry soldiers who died there. We're talking about hundreds. It wasn't a minor skirmish. It was a serious military conflict. China at that time didn't care about the Russian nuclear response. In the end, it got what it wanted to get. I'm not recommending Europe, like as I said, to completely ignore what's going on. But we have to understand that things are not necessarily how we think they are. They might be quite different.
Mikko, you.
Small addition. I certainly am not advocating kind of going soft on Russia because of the nuclear threat. But what I'm simply saying is that for the US especially, I think the problem here is that if this leads, according to their theory, if this leads to a kind of a direct confrontation between the US forces and Russians by some scenario or another, the problem here is that nobody knows how the escalation would be managed under that kind of a situation. I mean, you have a lot of theories, you have a lot of ideas how it could go. Yeah. And what Arkady mentioned about China and Russia, that is one kind of an historical example. We have others too. So I don't believe that the Russians would react kind of mechanically using nuclear, like if you cross that red line, whatever line it is, that then they will respond. But I think the fundamental problem for the US and consequently for us is that you don't know how to manage the escalation. And that is, I believe, fundamental reason why President Biden is also, let's put it this way, in a diplomatic way, he's calculating very carefully all the moves he's going to take.
I mean, I think it was on the intelligence panel yesterday, one of the panelists talked about it as a psychological game of nukes. And the way I look at it is we're losing, right? I mean, we talk about Russian nukes way more than the Russians talk about ours. Why is that?
I believe the reason is that I don't see how our leaders would convince our publics to support a kind of more aggressive, threatening nuclear stance.
Right.
We are democracies. There's a public opinion. How the public opinion in the US would respond if a president would say that, hey, let's hit them with the nukes, and then they would counter-hit us. And so it's a no-go politically. So that's, I think it's a fundamental reason.
Arkady, sure.
The price of human life in Russia is a lot lower than it is in the West. During COVID, they were losing 2,000 people a day, and it wasn't a national issue, whatever. And that continues. I mean, soldiers, okay, they're born to die for the Tsar. If we're short of them, we'll tell the women to deliver more. So what, I mean, I'm always often arguing that what Putin is doing is not the return to the Soviet Union and Soviet patterns, but some of this clearly are. This an attitude to people that people are for the state and not the state for the people. It's an axiomatic, it's one of the pillars on which that society is built. Everything becomes routine. I said it in many of my interviews. In the beginning of Kursk, I said, give them 2 weeks. It's not going to be the first news anymore. It will be, they will get used to it. They have gotten used to it. I mean, now what we hear that, well, first we have to reconquer Donbass. After that, we'll gather forces to get Kursk back. So this is not, politically, there is no issue here. Okay, let them, although from our point of view, many things, it was a meaningful thing. It wasn't a game changer, but it was a big thing. But it's not how people in Russia think about it.
Katri, can you make us feel all a bit better and talk about some of the weaknesses that Russia has?
Oh my God.
Please.
Well, yes, actually, but this is again a very delicate one, because if we talk about the European agency in this whole thing, how to end the war, how to make it on the terms that are good for Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there has to be something more than what we see now. And then comes this idea that, okay, what are the weak spots of the Kremlin? It's the preservation of power, how you preserve power in a totalitarian system. For example, through managing and shaping the information environment and having a kind of complete or more complete control of it. And then we come to the question like, not in a way that, okay, let's put the nukes on the table and then try to persuade Putin not to do something, but rather let's look at the weaker points that there are. But this is already like talking about changing Russia, which is again then one of the main arguments that this is actually what the West is trying to do, weaken us, etc. So it's a circle. So it's very difficult to find a way to influence a country that has a total ideology of war at the moment. So Russia has really changed by this war, because of the war it is fighting against Ukraine. And somehow it's such in a new, it's in a very different place where we are, where regular like European countries and their leaders are. So I don't have an answer for you, sorry. I would like to have.
I can list at least 3 major weaknesses of Russia. There are many more, but I'll concentrate on 3. 1, Russian economy, including the military economy. You can try to militarize the economy, but I'm sure that Joseph Stalin is rolling in his grave when he hears that Russia is dependent on artillery shells coming from North Korea. A superpower cannot fight the war without getting shells from North Korea. I mean, this is a totally humiliating from the point of view. If you want to present...
It's slightly more humiliating that North Korea can supply more to Russia than we can supply to Ukraine. That's humiliating.
Then the global south, which we somehow say is on the Russian side. It is not. The solidarity with Russia is actually at a very low level. I mean, people are playing their games, some trying to extract money from Russia, some because they are anti-American. But you look at the UN votes, you get the pattern. I mean, 5-7 countries vote together with Russia. The other are either against or sitting on the fence and abstain. Most recent Russia-Africa summit, if you compare the one that happened last year and with the one which happened 5-6 years ago, you will see that the attendance is colossally lower. I mean, some countries didn't come at all. And at least half countries didn't send the top leaders. I mean, there would be a deputy minister present. So this is not the solidarity which you expect. We would expect there if the global south was indeed behind Russia. China is a different story. It's correct that in the NATO summit's communique, China is called the key enabler. But there's only one other country mentioned as an enabler, and that's Belarus. And that's also humiliating. Belarus is an enabler of Russian actions against Ukraine. It's correct, but it's mind-boggling. And finally, and most importantly, same Russian society. The apathy of the Russian society, which is a key to Putin's extension of his stay in power, is one of the most undermining factors now, because people do not consider this war as an existential war. I mean, they're happy to participate if they're paid, or if they have no other choice and they get to be mobilized, choosing between jail and death on the battlefield. That also tells you a lot of people. People choose to die on the battlefield except instead of serving their term in the jail. That's also a characteristic. But anyway, these guys cannot, I mean, they admit that they're puzzled. That kind of, on the one hand, they themselves don't call it a war, they call it a special operation, but then they don't see the mobilization and the rally around the flag in the country. There is a certain group of people, about 25%, it's not changing, which seriously supports the war, but not necessarily going to the front. And the other maybe 45% passively supports the war by not speaking against it, and the rest are against, But that's the point, that for Russia, this is not an existential war. And that's a weakness of a country waging a war of such a scale.
Mikko, you also raised your hand.
Yeah, perhaps just to mention that if you look at historically, those situations where Russia did collapse during the war, basically was not the Second World War. The Germans were at the outskirts of Moscow. The Russians were able to pull it through. Then you had this First World War, when it actually did collapse because of the many reasons. I don't think we see anything like that forming around Russia inside the country. So my conclusion simply is, and I'm not happy to make this conclusion, is that this system that Putin has built during the last 20 or so years seems to be especially capable of waging this type of war for a very long time. And it's a sad conclusion, but how can you come to arrive at any other sort of thinking? Then how do you actually then plan for the future? How do you touch those? I simply don't have a good answer, but my problem here with the usual Western discussion is that we seem to have an assumption that some of those weaknesses that they obviously have, like Arkady just explained, that some of those weaknesses then miraculously becomes a kind of fatal problem, and somehow we can get rid of this. It kind of goes away in a way, in a kind of a mystical way. And this is a kind of a dangerous thinking pattern because it kind of leads us to underinvest in our own defense. It leads us to all kind of fairy tale thinking, like looking for signs, like when Wagner had this mutiny, we kind of many of us did expect that now it's starting, it's going to change things. So we are looking for these small signs. When I was in Moscow, a lot of people, when you had a demonstration, like 10,000 people were always like asking that, is this now it?
Yeah.
It's 15 million people, so it's a very small thing. So I think this thinking pattern that follows is a bit of a danger. Then when Arkady mentioned North Korea and artillery shells, I don't think we are so much better at artillery shells because we are actually using South Korea as a source. So I think we have to be really self-critical also in that.
I'm keen to get questions from the audience, so if you have, put up your hands. But normally I say, so while you're thinking of them, I'll ask one, but so many hands just went up. But just finally, I mean, on this topic, I wanted to round it off. I've noticed in conversations I'm having in Brussels, and actually in DC at the NATO summit, was regime change is not taboo anymore in Russia. Some people are actually talking about it as something that we should be strategically aiming for. Mikko, I want to start with you. The United States doesn't believe that, right?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
I think the calculation is this system is probably too strong and too stable
To try.
to try, and you don't know how to do it, first. Secondly, you have all these competing demands. The biggest problem is elsewhere. So why would you kind of focus all your resources, not only military, economic, informational, etc., on this problem? So it's not the top priority globally for the US. Thirdly, I guess there's also a thinking like if you would then surprisingly succeed, then what? Because the conclusion, I think, also in Washington is that most likely the challenger for Putin's system comes not from the democratic side, but rather from the hardliners. So you may even have a tougher system, more irresponsible regime. You better be careful what you wish for.
But this is another example of that thing, right? We're just like, oh, it could be even worse.
Yeah.
Oh, it's really bad. They're just so bad. Katri, is regime change possible? And can the West make it happen faster?
Well, I think maybe there could be something, but let's remember actually a book written in the early 90s with the title, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. And this is, I think, the message also by the Russian oppositions in Europe, that you can't predict it, you can't, in a way, it's difficult to make it happen, but it is possible. And then to have a really different Russia, there has to be a regime that undoes the war ideology that is currently the main thing in anything Kremlin is doing. So you can't have a Russia and peace in Europe until this ideology is undone. And it requires like a huge effort. So, and also huge effort from outside. But is that the best bet right now? I don't know. I think we still might be better to focus on to get Ukraine out of this war in a one piece.
Where are those hands gone? Yeah, the gentleman here was very enthusiastic in the blue shirt. Please introduce yourself and keep your questions short, sharp, and succinct. Thank you.
My name is Kimmo Kiljunen. I'm actually parliamentary. I'm chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Finland, participating in Helsinki Security Forum just now. You mentioned the new security structure to come is against Russia. That's the only way to have it against Russia. You are in a place, obviously, celebrating next year 50 years of Helsinki Accord. I don't go to that area. Further, only mentioning, obviously, that if that's the only picture in future against Russia, all the new security structure, our geopolitical situation is not the easiest. It's not the easiest. We are frontline state, and obviously must not. That seems to be a very desperate picture. Instead, 2 weeks ago, I was in Yalta Security Conference in Kiev. The same question, how you address Russia, was made to Mike Pompeo, the former state foreign minister of US during the Trump period. He put it very clearly. For us in Finland, obviously, the Ukrainian war is an existence question, fully existence question. But what Russia means today for US, including Democrats and Republicans, as he said, the president campaign is about power in the US, not about security policy as a whole. They share the view. It means three things today, and that's I want to ask you.
Sir, what's your question?
Yeah, exactly. The question comes now. How you react for Pompeo? Russia for him means, first of all, energy source. Secondly, nuclear weapons, obviously, existence question for them, as was mentioned. And thirdly, China. We had to stop this European war sooner or later, rather soon, because we cannot allow Russia to go totally in the pocket of China. a little bit Indian approach there. You can see it. China as the hegemonic power, as he said. I don't go details what he said further on that one. But yes, that's the approach from US. What is your reaction for Mike Pompeo?
Right. So are we basically being soft because of China, nukes, and energy? I think that was the question. Do you agree with Mike Pompeo?
He probably hasn't read the most recent brief. Because Europe is a lot less dependent on Russian energy. And again, to reverse it back and to go to the gas pipe deals and the Nord Streams, it will be very difficult. It would be much more difficult than to continue with the current system. But as for China, you know, it's a long conversation. I cannot explain it in one sentence. Russia is getting into the pocket of China. But I'm a scholar of Belarus. This is exactly the argument which for many years was put out as the explanation why the West should engage with Belarus. Because Lukashenko from time to time will have conflicts with Putin, so you tear him away from Putin, so you will be stronger, Putin will be weaker. So many things which are absolutely impossible from the point of view of the value-based approach to Belarus were done, argued for, and implemented. In the end of the day, there was still a crisis in Belarusian-Western relations. And yes, it has gotten into Russia's pocket, but it was on the way. I'm afraid that Russia is already in China pockets. And if you start making concessions to Russia in hope that each of these concessions will decrease Russian dependence on China by 1% or 0.1%, it's not a strategic approach. That's all that I can say.
We got nods here as well. It's just a yes.
Just a kind of an addition, I think Arkady is totally right. Still, like 3 years ago, I think there was still thinking in Washington that is there a way before the war to somehow pull Russia away from Chinese orbit. I think that discussion should be over with right now, but like Arkady said, perhaps the recent memo hasn't reached his hand, but I think this is what I actually got from DC, that it's over, it's impossible, and the Russian links with China economically, militarily, elsewhere are simply so strong.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe just to add that it's kind of, if you look at this list, there you see Russia as an object of something, maybe kind of part of the Chinese game, whatever, and then ignoring in a way the meaning that Russian leadership gives for this war, which is to restore, create the state power status and to actually undo the global system of powers and try to weaken the US position everywhere. So I would say that that's quite not enough as an analysis.
Poo-poo to Pompeo, I guess. Yeah, this gentleman here. You haven't asked a question yet, I don't think, this weekend.
Thank you very much. I'm Peter Eriksson, newly arrived as Swedish ambassador here in Helsinki. Once upon a time, colleague of Mikko's in Moscow. So obviously, it should be expected that in Helsinki, a panel about Russia is very clear-eyed and realistic, and I really appreciated this presentation. It was fantastic. I agree with practically everything. But I have a question. And early, when this conference opened, there was a suggestion that EU membership should precede NATO membership for Ukraine. That was the reasoning in the early 90s. You mentioned 93, when NATO enlargement discussion started. Everybody thought that, no, EU is better because that's less sensitive for Russia. But we know the history. Apart from Sweden and Finland, every new ally since the Cold War ended actually became NATO members first and EU members then. So obviously, if we are building a security system against Russia, shouldn't that be NATO and NATO with Ukraine as soon as possible? Thank you.
Mikko, I think that's for you.
Well, I do believe EU membership, even by the sort of legal and all those applications it's much more complex We know NATO is about defense, EU is about everything else, plus defense to an extent. So by definition, it's going to be a longer process, no matter how we would like to speed it up, or no matter how fast Ukraine meets the criteria. So I think Peter's comment sounds logical, comparing to how these accession processes in these two institutions have actually happened.
Very good question, but I want to ask it slightly differently to the two of you. Do you think Putin is more afraid of NATO than EU membership? Because I remember when we were in Moscow, there was this actually suggestion that perhaps the opposite is true, that the EU is much more scary because it can take a country and turn it into an economic giant, and Russians can say, wow, like the Latvians live much better than we do. Do you think he's still more afraid of NATO than the EU?
Are you asking me?
Yes, yes.
They are afraid of everything. I mean, they were only...
Finally!
They were, sorry, listen, they were arguing that the EU should come first because they knew EU was not coming because it's so complicated.
Yeah.
So if you put that barrier in front of the other one, it might take ages before it's going to happen. In general, we know one country which joined the EU and 28 years later realized that the EU was not enough, and you still need to join NATO. But I mean, it's easy to say this should go first or that should go first, but when you go into details, joining NATO is also not an easy thing. I mean, for that matter, talking about Korean scenario is not an easy thing, because a Korean scenario implies having 30,000 American soldiers to guarantee that new line. Is somebody in the West like who talks about all other, both NATO option and kind of other options of guaranteeing Ukrainian security in a certain way? That's what you have to start. If you have this, I don't know, 30, 40, 50,000 troops that you're ready to put on, the front line is now 1,000 kilometers. I mean, it's just, it should not be going on if you base your analysis on the Soviet field manuals. But it's nevertheless going on, and a lot of manpower would be needed to make any of these scenarios true. But NATO, getting into NATO is still easier than getting into the EU.
Katri, do you have anything to add, or should we?
Well, just that we here again, let's focus on what we discuss. So security guarantees that can have effect of stopping Russia being able to bomb Ukraine every day, and how to make it happen. And for my logic, I think the NATO should go first, because then you have to have certain security to be able to rebuild the country and to integrate it effectively with the rest of the Europe.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, we'll take my friend here in the front, in the striped shirt.
Right, thank you. Maximilian Tahalo, Defense Academy, Hamburg and Stanford. We've heard a lot about Putin saying about Western decadence, the flip side of which is what we talked about. It's this narrative of Russian invincibility. And I think we should nuke at least that narrative. The bottom line of his approach is his self-portrayal as a pack leader. And a pack leader loses internally when he's defeated. So I think we have talked much too little about the internal reverberations that the defeat in Ukraine would have in Russia. A pack leader will not survive if he's defeated in Ukraine. And that's why I think we should flip this narrative and focus on how Putin can be defeated, knowing that a pack leader will not survive in Russia if he gets defeated outside his territory, because he's no longer considered to be a pack leader afterwards.
But I think what we were saying is that we don't want to defeat him, right? The West is too scared of that.
Yeah, well, basically, I think we should defeat him, and obviously there is a way to defeat him. But that would require a massive investment in defense industries. It would require taking massive risks in terms of escalation. My problem with this is simply that as an analytical approach, I simply don't see it happening. I would like to see it happen, certainly, but I simply don't see it happening. So when this is the case, you can try to make the case. Go to the Republican Party Congress and try to make the case, see how successful you get, or Democratic. So it's so hard to convince those people to do so. So that's why I'm fairly kind of skeptical about how successful we do get. That's how it is.
And if you're skeptical, then Putin must be very, very skeptical that this is possible, right? I mean,
This is definitely, for example, now we have a lot of talks about peace in Ukraine. I happen to be totally skeptical towards the idea that this conflict could be somehow solved. Because even if there's for some miraculous reasons, even if you would have a ceasefire that would hold, more or less, I think that would be simply a kind of a temporary solution before renewed hostilities. The problem for us is that, and I think it makes it easier for Putin, is that he doesn't see a situation where we would really put so much at stake and send all those resources. And it's not only, I mean, the promises don't matter much, because Putin can also see how well your industries are coming up, how fast you produce these things. So you can't kind of, it's not about narrative. You really have to have real production figures. You really have to have real decisions. So he doesn't believe, and he doesn't see, certainly, a situation where the West puts so much effort in support of Ukraine that it would be credible for him to conclude that, hey, this war is unwinnable. As long as we don't do that, I think he has all the motivation in the world to continue.
We should not be, first of all, playing words, because here we say should or should not be defeated. I heard a different approach. Defeat Russia, but not crush. I mean, I'm not a philologist. I don't understand what people mean, but it looks like this eloquency is spreading around. Putin can afford to lose in Ukraine. How shall I say? I mean, how the defeat will look like, that will define many things. If it happens now, Putin will survive easily, because, I mean, we have already Saddam Hussein's scenario, when he stayed in power for 12 more years, and only then the new invasion was required to get him out of power. Since nobody is planning to send troops to Russia and have a real war on the Russian territory with the purpose of throwing Putin out of his throne and Kremlin, he will survive. There was a moment last year when difficulties started to grow, when it became clear that not everything is going to his plan. By the way, one of the top propaganda officers of Russia, Mr. Vladimir Solovyov, this week said, no, it's not going according to the plan, because finally, so if Ukrainian troops are in Kursk, does it mean it's going according to the plan? And that's the #1 propaganda officer of Russia. He just probably lost his mind. He's having so many preparations and speeches already. But the point is that Putin has already explained what a victory means to him, for instance. It's the existence of the Crimean Bridge, and it's the existence of the land corridor from Russia to Crimea. He was asked that question, I don't exactly remember when, about a year ago. And he said, isn't it much that we've secured the land corridor to Crimea? Why are you kind of denigrating our successes? His propaganda people will find 2 or 3 or 4 points which will be amplified and shown to the people as the evidence of the victory rather than that of defeat.
I've been struck in the last 6 months how Western leaders are saying, Putin's already been defeated. He wanted to take Ukraine in 3 days, and Ukraine has survived 2.5 years, and look, we're doing so great. And that narrative is being shifted. I think the ambassador had a question here. Yes. Sorry, you're not the ambassador. Sorry, I mistook you. Sorry.
I'm just deputy chief of mission, ambassador here. Hello, my name is Maxim Kravchuk. I'm from Embassy of Ukraine. I'm so grateful for this discussion. One thing which we missed during this conference is a good talk about accountability. Because without accountability wouldn't be any just and lasting peace, and wouldn't be any European security at all. So my question to the panelists, and maybe to all participants of this conference, whether the global West can ensure accountability. Thank you.
And I will add, is Putin afraid of that? Katri.
Well, maybe I start. What I see is a lot of work by different groups to collect material, to document the war crimes against humanity conducted by the Russian troops in Ukraine. And I'm really, when I see how Ukrainians are dealing with these awful crimes, I can't just but to be like amazed. And I see that it is really important. And then I think the second point is that we, in a way, have to unearth these intentions and the political statements and the whole plan that there exists. And then it is a matter of years and years and years to produce the history of this war as it is, and not the story that the Kremlin is trying to sell to everyone, because they are really good at playing with this uncertainty. But to answer actually the question, I think perhaps slightly, but not enough.
Yep.
He is not afraid, but he is not comfortable. It's pretty clear that the fact that he couldn't go to South Africa to the BRICS summit last year and had to be on the screen doing the video address, for the person as narcissistic as Putin is, there must have been a big thing. And they had to invent a reason to go to Mongolia, again, just to demonstrate that he can go to certain countries and not be arrested. So I'm sure that he's not comfortable and he would want things to work differently. I'm sure that he would still be willing to travel to all sorts of capitals in the West and get a standing ovation as he got in 2001 in the German Bundestag, or also during some of the meetings even here. But not a standing ovation though. And he would like to be traveling. He wouldn't want to look like just a bigger Lukashenko. He would want to be in a company of world leaders deciding questions, but he can't. So it matters. As for the rest of the country, as for the people, I don't know. Soldiers who committed all these atrocities and crimes, I don't know. The only thing which I kind of can put in this context is that sometimes justice comes to the countries and the people. We have now in Russia several hundred, I think 350 cases, or maybe 250 cases, my memory might be failing me, where the recent veterans who had been convicts before going to the front line, we still don't understand why they are released, while the normal mobilized not ex-convicts cannot, having served a certain term, go back home or be on the rotation. These guys, for some reason, are allowed to go back to their villages. What do? Kill people, torture, rape. It's not yet has reached the size when it would be considered a problem for the whole nation. But certainly even the pro-government newspapers cannot hide it anymore. It's a problem. They created a problem and they will be paying, or Russia as a whole, as a country, will be paying for the problem which they created themselves. But of course, I cannot give you a strategy 1, 2, 3, what needs to be done.
Mikko, I mean, if the West isn't willing to crush Russia, they're surely not willing to put Putin in manacles.
Well, I think, of course, there should be an accountability. I think that's a starting point. But if I judge how the Russian elite thinks about this thing, I think for most of them, it's completely unthinkable that any kind of accountability would be there for them. And I think even many of those people that would be otherwise rather critical towards the war would find it hard to accept a kind of a country-based, full legal, political accountability. So I think it's, unfortunately, I think it's a very, it must be very late in this process, whatever the process is going to be. And politically speaking, if the Russians would kind of accept this kind of accountability, we would first have to see very different Russia, politically, mentally, societally, etc., etc. So I think it's a long way.
We've got time for 2 more questions, and I'll take them simultaneously. The lady here. Excellent.
Thank you. My name is Carolina Vendel-Pallin. I'm from the Swedish Defence Research Agency, and thank you for a brilliant panel. My main question would be whether we can influence Russia in any other way than building a military deterrence. It's one of the questions Russia specialists always get. How can we influence Russia? My response is always, only a credible military deterrence can influence decision-making in Russia, but are there other means?
Very good question, and yes, this gentleman here. There's behind you.
Markus Holmgren from Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Wars are tools of generating data on making wars. They train the generals, train the troops, train the industry, train the political system, and generates data about smart systems, how to train even better weapons. Now my question is, how would we end the war in a way that would teach Russia as little as possible about how to improve its war-making capabilities in near future? Thank you.
2 very good questions. Can we influence Russia in any other way apart from military deterrence? Arkady.
Well, you have to make the West a success story back again. Its economy has to start working differently. Its societies sometimes have to start working differently, but it's about starting at home. And it's going to be, or would be, a long game. I mean, we would be talking about a generation. That's one thing, but that would be good for the societies, by the way. If for instance, they could be producing more. Anyway, it's a long story. The other thing which works already now, and it has to be, we have to step up the effort. It's the information. It's getting information into Russia. Up until recently, the Russian government didn't care about, for instance, the accessibility, free accessibility to YouTube. Now we know that it does care. Although for 2 years we were saying that most of the people going on YouTube or TikTok for that reason, they put the likes of the cats or play games on the internet. But we don't know what exactly changed and how it changed, but it's clearly changed because we can judge by the reactions of the Russian government that they're no longer free. They're longer, again, comfortable or happy with the system which they have, where people get access to certain information. The number of people in Russia who are against the war is still significant. It's about 25,000 people, percent, sorry, of the population. It's been there all the time. Unfortunately, we failed. We failed these people in a certain extent because they are left there. They are getting messages not only through the Russian propaganda system, but through the real news, that the treatment of, for instance, the Russian emigration, I don't call it the Russian opposition, because not all of them are opposition, but the emigration, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, that the treatment was very far from benevolent, that it's the people who do not want to fight the war, who escaped Russia. They've been receiving totally not unwelcoming treatment in Europe and had to come back. They cannot get the papers in order. They cannot get their passports renewed. It's a long story. I mean, this is about what can be or must be done back home. What we're hearing is the collective responsibility of all Russians, in which I have to admit I predicted myself on the day when the war started in February 22. There is my interview to Uli Russian, where but it's still wrong. The approach has to be individual. For that matter, people know it, so I can say it. I didn't like at all the discussion during the presidential campaign in Finland that all the dual citizens of Russia and Finland should be, unless they revoke the Russian citizenship, should be deprived of the Finnish citizenship. This conversation was a nuclear bomb. This is because what you're doing, or the people who were carrying on this conversation, basically they sent a signal to 40,000 people here but they're not welcome here, regardless that they did everything following the law, regardless for how many years they've been citizens, regardless, for instance, of the fact that they had to learn the language to become, they made an effort to become Finnish citizens. And now they are a category of people which has to be punished most. It's exactly wrong. These things should be avoided, and the approach to the Russians already living in Europe will have to be different. And it is actually different in some countries. I was going through the figures. I mentioned the Finnish border at some point. I went through the figures. As of the first half of the year, most European, the travel of Russians or Russian citizens into these countries grew from 20 to 70%. 70% is Hungary, okay, 66% is Montenegro. But many countries have increased the inflow of the Russian citizens. How it's done, I know the mechanics. Yes, you wait for your visa not for 1 week, but for 2 months. But people are traveling. But there are countries which still think it's 22. It's not 22. And to make Russia less resilient, you have to have a totally different approach to the Russian citizens already living abroad.
We're really running out of time, and you wanted to jump.
Yeah, very shortly, if I would like to put my wish list as an answer to Karo, I think it's correct that we should have a correlation of forces, a real one, in Europe's favor, so they have a credible military deterrence. But that takes time, as we have discussed. So what to do in a short run? We should maybe do more with the disruption of Russian monopoly on weaponizing the information. So look at that area, which is also difficult because it's something that we don't like to do or talk about. But I see that it's somewhere there, these two things, the military capabilities, real ones, that Russia and Putin really sees, and the intentions there, which is not at the moment necessarily, and then something faster with the disruption of what Russia is actually already doing with the information domain.
Thank Mikko. Your final word. I'm going to butcher the question, but I think it was how do we make sure that we learn from the war in Ukraine to be stronger in the future? This is roughly what you asked, I think.
I think we are learning already, and obviously the war so far has been very different each year.
Yeah.
So it's a really a moving target, and I think we are drawing conclusions. What I think it's probably going to be more difficult is to how to really deploy the learnings we've had, how fast to deploy them, how really make it happen. Because, and also as a comment to what my colleagues just told, I think, yes, on the military, everybody agrees on that. That we and then we also say quite often that it takes time. Obviously it does, but we haven't made those decisions yet to really go high enough, get strong enough. I think we are lacking those. So I think the military aspect is obviously the key in order to help Ukraine, but also in order to strengthen ourselves. But I think Arkady is also right. I think we have to, this conflict and all the other conflicts globally that will influence us, they are of such magnitude that we really have to take a fresh look at our societies. How do they work, according to which principles we are making them work? So it's a more fundamental challenge than just how to end the war in Ukraine and how it's going to happen. So it's a broader challenge.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time. Thank you so much for listening. You've been a great audience. To Mikko, Arkady, and Katri, you guys were fabulous. Sorry it was a bit of a gloomy way to start the day, but go grab a coffee and some sweet snacks. Thank you.
Coffee, no coffee.
Thanks.
No coffee.
No coffee.
Thank you. Thanks.
Just a thing. So good morning, everybody. Let's take some seats. You'll have a chance to get your coffee in about 35 minutes. We're now going to widen up the discussion from our duck pond up here in Northern Europe to the Middle East and have a different take. I think it's very important that we also hear from colleagues from the Middle East, from the Persian Gulf, how Europe and the situation here looks today. My name is Olli Ruohomäki. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at FIIA, focusing very much on the Middle East. I had the distinct pleasure of meeting Dubai, Abulhoul, about a year ago in the Emirates, and I was very impressed by her sort of astute analysis of geopolitics and quite a few other issues. She is an accomplished Emirati author, a Rhodes Scholar, and a founder of Fiker Institute, which is an international affairs think tank based in Dubai. Fiker's institute's areas of research focus include, but are not limited to, decolonization, global governance, climate change, and gender equality. She's also, you're a filmmaker also.
It used to be.
Used to be, and you have also served with the Emirati Foreign Service.
Yes.
I understood, yes. So it's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Let's kick off with the interview. So amid Russia's war on aggression in Europe, in Ukraine, Europe has been really forced to rethink its energy security and geopolitical strategy in the Middle East and Persian Gulf. How do you perceive the ongoing impact of the Europe in Ukraine on Europe's security approach towards the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, particularly in terms of energy dependency and shifting alliances?
First of all, I want to thank FIIA and the Helsinki Security Forum for having me with you all here today. I think it's very important to not look at security in isolation. We cannot afford to have Europe only look at its own conflicts and the Middle East look at its own conflicts. They're all interconnected, and I think conversations like this help not only bring our views more closely aligned, but also have a very frank discussion on the realities on the ground. I think for too long, and particularly in the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, Europe has sidelined the Middle East a bit and has really taken for granted its relationship with Gulf capitals. And Gulf capitals in particular have always been ready and capable to be energy suppliers to different parts of the world, but their energy transition has been criticized as being too slow. And I think fast forward to the war in Ukraine, and you see them emerge as credible allies to Europe. But I think we need to look at our relationship as Gulf to EU beyond just the oil spectrum and beyond just energy security. Whether we look at it bilaterally, so different European capitals with different Gulf and Middle East capitals, or through a multilateral umbrella. I remember we discussed a bit how to promote or work on the development of EU-GCC cooperation. I think that scope needs to be more broadened, and the Middle East and the Gulf can't be looked at as sort of like a second option when war erupts. Relationship building takes time, and it's important for that relationship, if that relationship is to grow, we need to put rhetoric aside and focus on thematic areas that are actually of utmost importance to both regions, whether it's energy security, whether it's AI. I think what Europe misses really, or hasn't really realized, is the Gulf and the Middle East are moving towards a very multipolar world order, and that doesn't mean the same thing here. So I follow very closely Western analysis and think tanks, and there's always this bucketing of, the West versus the rest. And I always say, the rest is the majority, so it's not to the West's advantage to use that binary. We need to broaden up the scope and need to deal with each other in a more nuanced policy manner, I would say.
Thanks for that, Dubai. Sort of slightly linked to this question is that how is the war in Ukraine viewed from the Middle East and Persian Gulf, particularly again, in terms of, you said a bit about the energy markets and regional security, but also diplomatic relations. Are there any significant sort of shifts in how Middle Eastern countries and Persian Gulf countries are aligning themselves in response to the conflict in Ukraine?
I think we see an evolution, particularly across different Middle Eastern positions on the war in Ukraine. But I think it's important to kind of go back a little bit towards the beginning of the war and sort of international or Western shock at how, the Middle East didn't just rally behind Western allies and Western capitals. And it's important to understand the mood of the region. Pre the war, there was always this sense that our conflicts and our wars have been relegated to the side. This idea that, of course, there's another war erupting in the Middle East. And this sense of... and particularly, I know we'll get to Gaza in a bit, but the sense of almost dehumanization of Arab life has been very difficult for the region to come to terms with. And I remember very early on in the war, there was coverage. Not that I take Fox News as like the epitome of Western excellence, but I remember coverage on Ukrainian refugees, and there was a comparison that said, these are not. There was a news anchor who described the situation as these are not refugees from Syria. They're blue-eyed, they're blonde. And the region really was very taken aback by that. And a human life is a human life regardless of where it's lost. And that's where the region took a pause and said, enough of this relegation of secondary importance to our region. We are sovereign nations, and the reaction wasn't, pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. What it was is anti-double standards when it comes to international law and when it comes to looking at the region. I always say, we've had it with the world talking to the Middle East. We want the world to talk with the Middle East.
Yeah. It's a tough conversation. I recall when Finland was joining NATO and, of course, talking about the Ukraine war, I was interviewed in Al Arabiya and Al Ashraq, I think it's Abu Dhabi-based TV channels, and trying to explain, what's going on here from our viewpoint. And there were some really tough conversations, but also very useful ones. And I was glad to be able to also share this conversation. I think the viewers, there was like about 50 million people online watching that interview. So I was like, wow.
You need to send me the
hardcore discussions. Okay, let's talk a bit about Israel's current actions, particularly in Gaza, and of course, as we are watching, as it is unfolding, the events in Lebanon at the moment. You already mentioned and alluded to the fact that, at least from some quarters in the world, Israel's actions have really drawn widespread criticism. But how do you assess the international community's response? And maybe you need to break down a bit. What is the international community? How is international community understood also in your region towards and to Israel's policies in Gaza, in Lebanon? And also, what more could be done to address the dire situation, both in Gaza and Lebanon? And also the worries that the things might really get out of hand and really explode big time. Way beyond Ukraine, actually, if you compare to what's going on in the Middle East at the moment.
I think it's definitely a multi-layered answer to this, so I'll try to answer the different chunks to the best of my abilities. But coming from the region, coming from the Middle East, we are in pain. We feel very paralyzed, we feel very disappointed with a sort of paralysis in international law that we haven't seen to this extent. And I'm a multilateralist, I'm a proponent of international law. I think despite its flaws, it's the only way forward, but it feels like it's not being applied equally. And when we talk about the erosion of trust in international law, it's not going to make anyone safer. When we look at the UN and we look at the sort of honest paralysis in what's happening, and we all see the complete chaos and a genocide in real time on our phones, there's really the long-term impact of this on young people in the region. I don't think this part of the world is quite aware of. And international law must be looked at as the great equalizer. We've seen progress with the ICJ. We've seen the sense of, international law can still address the international community's biggest concerns. But I think, it's not enough. And we cannot talk about even Israel's security without talking about the need for the establishment of a Palestinian state. I think when we talk about Europe, I'm very much against sort of bucketing everyone again into a West spectrum. But I think tangible steps have been made that can be built on, like the recognition coming from Norway, Ireland, and Spain. I think there's a sense that, this cannot take this long, this cannot continue unfolding in the way that it has. But there are nuances that we also need to tackle. For example, I've followed how there's been contention on numbers of those who have been killed in Gaza. There are around 40,000 according to the UN. And the fact that that even is debated in Western media and circles as, no, it's not 40,000, it's 10,000. A human life is a human life. A child is a child. One child murdered is one too much. And I think that needs to be talked about more. We need to go beyond the sort of rhetoric, like asking for condemnation here and there, and getting to the point of, how can the international community, how can Europe take its diplomatic weight globally and actually put a stop to this? How can we get to a ceasefire? And it's very easy to get lost in the details now of like, okay, what happens next? We cannot even talk about the day after without us stopping, what's happening. It's getting out of control, as you said. It's beyond Gaza now. Lebanon is there. Just before the session, I've been checking on my friends, and in the past 48 hours, 1 million Lebanese citizens have been displaced internally. This is no longer, a 2-week timeline. This is real. It's getting out of hand, and we would really, if anything, require the support of the EU's political and diplomatic weight to not just diffuse tensions, but to say enough is enough, and international law needs to apply to everyone and all sides as well.
Maybe just a further vignette to that. I mean, we have you have the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a very important platform in the Persian Gulf, and then we have Europe. So what do you see, what would be the sort of ways of enhancing and deepening and strengthening this cooperation between European Union, EU, and the GCC?
I think it's twofold. So you have the Gulf as a regional multilateral umbrella. It's mostly concerned with, I would say, coordination on foreign policy, on military and defense, but also that cannot be looked at in isolation from bilateral relations as well with different key capitals. Every Gulf country has a sort of different sector it's focusing on. So whether we're looking at AI, and we were talking a bit earlier on cybersecurity, I think a lot of that can happen quicker bilaterally between different European capitals and their counterparts in the Gulf, but strengthening sort of EU-GCC cooperation beyond annual conferences and to really get to perhaps the development of a very swift, very quick reactive working groups can perhaps be a way forward. But the sort of older mechanism of, let's just meet and once a year is not gonna help.
Yeah, because the world is developing and things are changing so in such a rapid pace that you need a constant dialogue to go forward. Let's talk a bit about your work on human rights and governance in the Middle East and Persian Gulf, because when we met a year ago in your office in Dubai, I was really taken and sort of impressed by your analysis. So, Europe has been supporting in the past, democratic transitions and promoting human rights in the region. But then there are, of course, strategic interests and partnerships play a part. So, I mean, what's your sort of take on the whole human rights, democracy discourse and role of outsiders, and then, how you see things in the region?
I think I take a bit of issue, if you allow me, with the framing of the question, because I think that kind of rhetoric has really led us to where we are today. As a region, we have grown, quite frankly, fed up with a saviorist narrative towards us. When I'm in conferences like this, I always realize the audience is slightly surprised when they see that I'm not an oppressed woman asking to be saved in this part of the world. And that kind of represents just one aspect. There's this one-way dialogue on human rights that have plagued our region for too long, and the sort of very lecture-based approach. not keeping in mind any context on how our social structures are built, no knowledge on the history of both Gulf monarchies as well as legitimacy of rule in different parts of the Gulf, and the tribal systems that we hold very dear. We're very proud of our history, we're very proud of our context, and we're vehemently against parachuting, sort of Western democratic models into the region. I think, if anything, Western intervention in Iraq should have been the last time we asked that question. But it's not to say that this is a denial of realities on the ground. It's to say we have agency over our own domestic affairs, and there are things that we would love to have a dialogue with the West on when it comes to human rights, but it needs to be a two-way dialogue. I've had delegation, a group of Harvard students visit our think tank, and I can almost recite their allegations, and I was like, tell me, or I can tell you what you're about to tell me. And it's again not to kind of create a sense of whataboutism, but is to say, we're no longer okay with this one-way flow of criticism of, it almost feels. If you want to empower women, don't tell us how to do it. We know our context, we know our history, and we're very happy to engage into a dialogue. I always say, how ridiculous would it be if, I took a delegation to Washington to tell them, let's save women in Texas from, what's happening. And women around the world need to talk. We need to have mechanisms like this, but it needs to be productive. The same old Orientalist templates don't have any space anymore in 2024.
I agree 110% with you. I'm very impressed. Thanks. Maybe one more question, and then maybe we can have a couple of Q&As. So looking ahead in the sort of near or middle-term future, I mean, how do you envision the Middle East, Persian Gulf, European relations developing in terms of security, in terms of economic partnerships, and also, very importantly, political cooperation? I mean, what kind of steps could we both take to work on this file?
One of the main reasons we launched Laurier-Institute 3 years ago now was to really also build a Europe studies program, because I think it's not just Europe needs to know more about the Middle East. We need to study Europe as well, and I think that's a mind shift that wasn't previously there. I think in the region there are countless Middle East experts, in Brussels, but I can count only a few EU experts in the Middle East, and so that imbalance in knowledge production and policy formation is definitely a gap that needs to be filled. I think there's a lot of space for the third sector, so think tanks, research entities, NGOs, to help bridge that gap. So yes, you're always going to have sort of track one, diplomatic relations, track one, defense, intelligence, etc. But what you really need is track two and track three, and bringing in researchers and civil society as well in the conversation. So I think more of that platform building is really important, and forums like this are a great example. The second aspect I would look at is how can we capitalize more on thematic cooperation. So not just looking at it, through sort of hard policy lens. Yes, you're going to have your mechanisms for defense, but how can we look at climate security as well? Climate migration is not talked about enough, and the ramifications of it are going to be disastrous. So how can we look at thematic ways within the security defense spectrum, including climate, including AI? I think AI needs to move from being a talking point to actually being, a policy consideration. And how does that look like tangibly? And the sort of global AI arms race is not one that we can afford Europe and the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf, not talking to each other on as well.
Thanks for that, Dubai. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I think we'll get Mark.
Mark Katz, Chair of the FIIA Scientific Advisory Council, and I've written a little bit about the Gulf's relations with Moscow over the years, and I appreciate your explanation, your discussion of the UAE's view in particular of maintaining good relations with Russia as well as the West, and I would even say that there's been some positive elements. In other words, the UAE's role in prisoner exchanges between the Ukraine and Russia. But one thing I think I'm wondering is of concern to you, and that is, as we've seen the war in Ukraine continue, we've seen Russia's dependence on Iran grow. And of course, Iran presents a challenge to many countries on the Arab side of the Gulf. And I'm just sort of wondering, it seems to only make sense, to pursue the relationship with Russia if Russia can restrain Iran, but can Russia do that? In other words, does your good relations with Russia pay off in terms of restraining Iran or not? And is that something of concern to you? Thank you.
I think we've seen, particularly in the past year and a half, a sort of rapprochement between Gulf capitals and Iran. I think the emphasis has been from Gulf countries, whether it's their relationship with Russia or Iran, an emphasis on de-escalation. I think early on, there were a bit of doubts on how that would work. But I think, as you said, initiatives, particularly from the UAE and Qatar on the prisoners exchange is one way that I think has been a win, really, for relations not just between, directly UAE and the Gulf, Ukraine and the Gulf, but also Europe and the Gulf. It forged a space where there was scope for a midway in terms of what can we work on together instead of taking a very black and white approach to it. I'm not sure, to be very honest, how to read Iran's development on that, particularly with everything else happening right now in the region. I think the Gulf capitals will continue to urge for restraint, but I don't see a sort of direct confrontation in the coming phase.
Thanks. Katja, I think your hand was up, wasn't it?
Katja Kreutz from FIIA, but I think I'll just have a comment, and I have the comment in my capacity as an international lawyer. So you said that international law is the great equalizer, or it should be the great equalizer. In my opinion, that's putting the expectations way too high for international law as a legal system. Because we have to acknowledge that international law gets its precise content from politics, so it's not separate from politics. So the practices, the opinions, the statements, they all form what international law really is about. So there's no neutral reading of international law. And we can take non-intervention as a rule that we find in the Charter, and we all know that it's very contested, and people can give it a million different readings. But I do share, the desire to be more mindful of how we treat international law and its rules, and of course try to apply it in more equal ways across, in different parts of the world. Thank you.
And if I might add, actually, on that, a big thing that I can kind of see Europe and the Middle East really work on or champion is how do we put forth a global governance reform agenda that can address these points as well. I'm a fan of the UN General Assembly, but it seems like the speeches are repeated every single year. Almost everyone talks about the need for global governance reform, but there hasn't been an actual effort to put forth what that looks like. We talk about UN Security Council reform, but tangibly as next steps, what can we do about it? Otherwise, we'll keep repeating it with every UNGA.
Thanks. Any others? Gentleman up I think it's David Korpela. Yes, my good colleague.
David Korpela from the EU Office of the Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa. You mentioned the multipolar world and the GCC's view of itself within that framework. I wonder if you could say a few words about that. How I hear the term middle powers being used. How does the Gulf view itself as part of this multipolar world? And also we see the Gulf venturing into the mediation space. So do they see themselves as a bridge between China and the West or resolving some of the conflicts? Maybe a bit of reflection on that could be very useful. Thank you.
Sure. I think what I tried to mention earlier was multipolarity means different things to different regions. So when you talk about multipolarity in the US context, it's this binary of, a US versus a China-led order. In Europe, my reading of it is that just means total chaos. But in the Gulf in particular, it presents an opportunity to not look at international engagements in a very hierarchical way. It's a time where you can look at forging partnerships and alliances beyond and perhaps even without US-led frameworks. I think BRICS is a good example of that. It's still too early to kind of look at a potential BRICS Security Council. I don't think that's the direction it's going in. But what multipolarity looks like for the Gulf when viewed positively is a chance to be able to not look at international affairs in a hierarchical manner, but perhaps a more horizontal one, one where you can work with different countries and regions on different thematic issues versus always be plugged or forced to choose between one side or the other.
Thanks. Since the first panel went a bit on overtime, we still have a couple of minutes. Any other questions, comments from colleagues? Or are you thirsty for coffee?
There's one on.
Please, Professor Paula Vanninen.
So thank you. I was interested about your term that you are a little bit irritated about the women's position, that we Westerns, we come to teach you how women should be treated. And I know it myself that I have had a little attitude when we are doing teaching in Africa and Asia, that we somehow think that we should show how we do things in Western. And I know that in Finland, our things are not okay yet for the equal between men and women. But how would you teach us how we should come to your countries, not only Qatar, but also other countries, that we wouldn't irritate you, but we would more respect women's position and to put it forward?
Yeah, no, I think the fact that you're even thinking about this is a great step forward. It's not so much that we would kind of be irritated. It's the way approaches happen. So I understand that, within, particularly if we look at the EU Parliament, I can almost count like 20 statements they issue every year, and they have no idea, what the context is of what they're condemning and what they're boycotting. And it sort of feels very performative when parliamentarians kind of use our region as a talking point or as a way to kind of appeal to their voting base when they could have a conversation with us. Our countries are welcome, our institutes are open, and we want to have two-way dialogue. We want to hear your recommendations, and we also have input on things I think happening in other parts of the world as well. So it's a very basic psychological shift and change that I think the way forward is two-way dialogue, and what we have in common to solve is way bigger and way more important than the divisions that currently kind of put us on two sides of a spectrum. And maybe letting go of the sort of stereotypical ideas of the Gulf that, again, are still rooted in quite an Orientalist view. You'd be surprised at how many people would be very open to your suggestion and to have you join us in Dubai maybe very soon.
So thank you very much. I think on this very positive note, we can adjourn this part of the panel discussion and go for coffee. And please give a huge round of applause to Dubai Abulhoul.
Thank you.
We're happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, my mic is on. Everyone has their coffee, their last coffee burst they're going to need for HSF 2024. Thank you so much to those of you who've made it here to the end with us, and those of us joining on live stream as well, which I have done for part of this conference. And I think it's fitting that we are wrapping up this year with what is now the absolute crown of NATO and of European security, this now solid stretch of allies across the top of the alliance. With the inclusion of Finland and Sweden, of course, now NATO has an opportunity to incredibly increase security across the Arctic at the same time as environmental degradation and the increasing cooperation between Russia and China, of course, also increase insecurity on the other side. So I'm very happy to be hosting this final panel here this year. I am Teri Schultz. I'm a journalist who's been covering NATO and the European Union in Brussels for many years. But as I always say at HSF, I got my start here just out of university as a journalist here in Helsinki, and I have my master's from University of Helsinki. So I'm very tuned into the Nordic countries. On totta. And so anyway, I love hosting this panel, and I'm very happy to introduce my fellow panelists here. We're going to start with Särkkä. She is probably well known to most people here, a senior research fellow at FIIA. Alex Dalziel, a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier-Institute in Ottawa. Greg Pollock, principal director for Arctic and Global Resilience Policy in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense. And Masatoshi Murakami, he is associate professor at Kogakkan University in Ise, Japan.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Well, it's pronounced like Finnish a lot in Japanese, so
yeah, that's right.
It's easy to manage. So thank you very much to all of you for being here. And we're going to start with the sweet spot. Starting with Finnish and Swedish inclusion in NATO, Eero. This, of course, as I mentioned, this completes the defense across the top of the alliance, and this should be something. This is something that you focus on, and it's increasingly important. Of course, it comes just at the time that SHAPE and Sakur Kavoli has revamped regional plans. So it is the appropriate time to talk about this, the Arctic as a region which increasingly needs the deterrence and defense of NATO. So why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Thank you, Teri. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, it's really honored to be in this expert panel this morning. I'd like to start by saying that, in my view, NATO is currently at a critical conjuncture when it comes between balancing different security threats and challenges, Russia and China, different geopolitical domains and environments, and Arctic is certainly one of them. So the Nordic enlargement, I would argue, is really a game changer in this regard, because it shifts the center of gravity from NATO's southern and central flanks also to the northern flank and northeastern flank, which during the post-Cold War period was very much often forgotten flank, unfortunately. So I'd like to ask, is NATO doing enough in this regard at the moment? I think the process has begun, but a lot more could be done, and a lot is being actually done as we speak today. But if you just look at the NATO strategic concept from 2022, as well as the following Vilnius and Washington summit declarations, there's actually very little focus on the High North. There's actually only one paragraph in each of these documents that actually addresses High North.
Oh, yes. I should have known that already.
Yes, so I actually did some qualitative content analysis as a researcher, so I noticed that. But like I said, a lot is being done as we speak now. Finland just popped up the news last week that we will host NATO's forward land forces in Sodankylä, in the Arctic Lapland, and the
with Swedish as the
as the framework nation, which is brilliant. And also a few days ago we got the news that we will have the Land Component Command in Mikkeli in the South Karelia region. So I think really this is a game changer, because Finland and Sweden will bring the space to NATO. I think that's the number one thing. We will bring the land space and the airspace to NATO, and I think we should understand the Arctic as a region that encompasses from the Arctic Ocean all the way to the southern bits of the Baltic Sea. And in this, obviously, the Arctic 7 have a lot to do, the NATO's Nordic countries, United States and Canada, but I think we should also engage the Arctic other stakeholders in the region, as well as in the Indo-Pacific, which I'm sure we're going to hear about more today. So what will Finland bring to this equation, in addition to the land space? I think the focus will change now from the maritime domain also to the air domain and the land domain. So when you think of this land component command that we have there in Mikkeli, we bring a great deal of know-how, how to conduct land operations and how to plan those land operations as well in these extremely harsh, cold conditions and dark as well. So I think that is one of the really important key aspects that Finland will bring the capabilities, the Arctic capabilities into NATO, but not only the material capabilities, but all the different aspects of the capability, whether it's doctrinal, organizational, training, exercises, the know-how, how to survive in these extremely cold Arctic conditions. So I would call all the NATO Arctic countries really to increase the Arctic IQ now inside the alliance.
Oh, that's a good phrase, Arctic IQ. We can take that. And we should point out that there have been these exercises even before Finland and Sweden joined. The US has always sent its soldiers to these countries to train in these conditions that are hard to replicate anywhere else, right?
Right, that's correct.
Thankfully. They're hard to replicate. Okay, that's a great start from the Finnish perspective, Alex. So you're a specialist on the Russia-China nexus, and the Arctic is one of the most interesting aspects that we could now talk about, of course. The environmental aspects of this make this kind of cooperation between Russia and China even more significant, as if the politics didn't already help create that cooperation, right? So I'm really interested, and I think everyone is interested in hearing about what you think is happening right now and what we're likely to see in the near future as Russia and China draw closer together.
Thank you, Teri, and thank you to the organizers of HSF for having me here. So, the China-Russia relationship in the Arctic is a subcomponent of the larger relationship, and basically the Ukraine crisis has thrown accelerant on that, both in 2014 and then in 2022. Shifting from a situation where Russia had already had plans to kind of tap more into the Indo-Pacific and relations with China. 2014, it started to accelerate those to build up its resilience, and really in 2022, we saw Russia having to shift to China out of necessity, given the loss of European markets and sanctions, etc. So this has given China new opportunities in the Arctic, and this has to be set against China's overall problems, again, as kind of a function of its relationship with the USA, with the European Union, where its opportunities in the rest of the Arctic have shriveled. So China is very determined to have a polar presence. That's at both the North and South poles. And now Russia is really the best and to some extent only way that it can do this. So it finds Russia as we're aware, in a strategically weak position on this. Some of Russia's long strategic concerns about more or less managing China in the Arctic, while I still think they're there, Russia clearly has a much weaker hand to deal with. So if Russia wants to get to the Asian markets, the Northern Sea route, the Arctic, are extremely important parts of that. And I think we're seeing in terms of some of the development, particularly on the sea lane, we know the problems in the Panama Canal because of climate change, the Red Sea because of the Houthis and instability in the Middle East, China's long-term concerns about the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea, that their risk quotient on running through here and kind of testing proof of concept, although I think we're past that now, is there. So we see a few factors pushing China's attention north. I think we don't want to underestimate, you'll hear a lot, and I think this is where I try to emphasize quite a bit, is that people will bring up the factors about why this won't work. And there are, the China-Russia relationship is not defined by trust, it's not defined by mutual amicability, it's defined by interests and necessity. For Russia, the Arctic is extremely important. For China, much less. That gives it latitude. But if it wants to be in the north, it needs Russia. So I think we're going to see if, for geopolitical competition with the United States, it's a benefit for China to be in the north. It's a benefit for China to have Russia locked down as an ally and subordinate, so it kind of has its northern flank covered. And as we're looking at China and its continued attempt to remain the dominant player in critical minerals, rare earth elements, the construction of the manufacture of decarbonized fuel sources, making sure that it has privileged access, preferably at a discount, to the Russian Arctic, which is increasingly the focus of Russian economic development, is the north of its country for its mineral and energy resource development. So maybe I could just throw that out there. there. There's a few things we can pick up.
For sure.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing there is then also the pressure on China to reduce its support for Russia in other aspects, in sort of dual-use items. What I'm hearing here is that's one less reason why China would cut off Russia. If you're saying if they're so dependent on them to increase their Arctic capacity, then they're even less likely to respond to Western pressure.
I think it's one more reason.
Cut back the relationship. Interesting.
Yes, for sure. I think it's one more
if we need
reason.
more.
The Chinese have some scholars will point to the wait and see approach in the Arctic. They're hoping opportunities in Northern Europe, in Greenland, and Northern Canada, potentially even Alaska someday come back. Right now they have Russia. I do think it's important to think that this is not the main consideration. The competition with the United States of America is the main issue for China in its support to Russia. But this is one way they manage that relationship with the Russians.
Which is a fine transition into Greg, right? So Greg, I mean, you can pick up on China if you like, but one of the things that we wanted to mention here is that we are very lucky to have the newly appointed ambassador for the Arctic here somewhere, we think. Mike Frege?
Yep.
Is he here?
Yep,
Oh.
our new Arctic ambassador there in the corner of the room there.
Hi, I didn't get to meet you. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. Feel free to pop in any time here if you'd like to say something. Otherwise, Greg, so we, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg used to say frequently, I mean, I haven't heard it that recently, but that despite things going badly in other aspects of the US-Russian relationship, the NATO-Russian relationship, in the Arctic, at least things are still stable, right? The things that Russia cooperated with the West on were not deteriorating as quickly as everything else. But these were kind of low-hanging fruit, search and rescue operations, de-risking, and I'm putting it all on you. I mean, you don't have to speak for NATO, but is this still the case? The US has a new Arctic strategy out as of the summer. How much does what you've heard here so far, how much is that reflected in the new US strategy? Are you taking all of this into consideration? Is there more than, obviously, more than was handled by the NATO statement in Vilnius? I'm handing you a lot of stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take it from there. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to begin with my thanks to FIIA and my Finnish counterparts here in the Finnish government for all of the hospitality and engagement these last few days. Every individual I've engaged with here in Helsinki has been helpful and hospitable and kind, and it's been a pleasure to be here. As you noted, it's a special pleasure for me to be here at this moment where we have just had our Senate confirm our first Arctic ambassador, and it's going to be, I think, a joy for me from the Pentagon side to work very closely with Dr. Mike Frege and his team in the State Department. Mike brings tremendous experience and relationships across the Arctic, and so I'm very much looking forward to sort of taking our engagement on Arctic issues to a next level. There's something poetic about our last panel focusing on the Central Command area of responsibility, where so much of the Department of Defense has been engaged for the last few decades and remains so to a meaningful degree, but also to see this kind of pivot to the high north in some sense. As you noted, we do have a new U.S. Department of Defense strategy for the Arctic, which I would commend to all of you if you haven't gotten a chance to see it. I think Mike's appointment and confirmation, as well as this new strategy, reflects a growing U.S. and defense focus on the Arctic region. And there are some important reasons for that, of course. We've seen profound changes in the Arctic over the last several years, beginning with the geophysical changes happening in the Arctic as a result of climate change. And that means that sea lines of communication across the Arctic are going to become more open and available for both commercial traffic as well as conceivably for militaries over time here. And so we need to be thinking about the implications of all that. Of course, on the geopolitical front, we're in a very different place than we were even 5 years ago with respect to the West's relationship with Russia. I think we've certainly thrashed through that to a meaningful degree here over the last couple of days, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that more in the panel. Likewise, we see a more active China in the Arctic. It's notable to me that this past summer, the Shuilong 2, the Snow Dragon 2, was the first time a Chinese naval vessel, vessel paid call at Murmansk, and so we are seeing that kind of operational engagement between Russia and China that we monitor very closely being made manifest in some degree in the Arctic. And then we have, of course, the historic decisions by Helsinki and Stockholm to join NATO, and that brings a great deal of clarity so that we now have 7 of the 8 Arctic states all within NATO. And so I think your question began with a kind of high-level look at the state of cooperation in the Arctic. I think there are some who would look at matters in the Arctic Council, for example, which does not deal with security matters, and say Arctic cooperation is deteriorating in some degree. And I think that that's what's gone on in the Arctic Council. Norway's done a tremendous job, I think, managing those dynamics. But that's a reflection of the impossibility of real collaboration with Russian counterparts, even on science matters at this point in time as a result of its actions in Ukraine.
But we should point out that the Arctic Council suspended its normal operations because of Russia after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the Arctic Council is not meeting in its normal
It's
format
not meeting,
since then.
but it is continuing certain important, I think, lines of effort. So I don't think there's any intent to close up shop in the Arctic Council. That remains a very important diplomatic forum and a mechanism for some low-level engagement. But yes, clearly we are not carrying on anything like business as usual. But I think the point I want to make here is that while that's one framing, I think an alternative framing is that, at least on the security side in particular, engagement across the Arctic is at an all-time high. And there's a tremendous degree of alignment across what we call the Arctic 7. And so obviously bringing Sweden and Finland into NATO was an important part of that. We also see, I think, growing collaboration in a variety of fora across the Arctic 7, even beyond NATO. Of course, NORDEFCO is an important mechanism here in the Nordic states for collaboration. So while the Arctic Council is not fully functioning at this time, we do see, I think, a tremendous amount of shared values, shared interests, and a tremendous amount of capability up here in the high north. And we're looking forward to deepening that as we go about implementing our new strategy, enhancing our capabilities with our allies and partners, exercising presence in the Arctic, and really kind of deepening our ongoing connections with Arctic allies.
Do you think Russia feels like it lost anything in the Arctic Council, suspending it from participation? I mean, was this one of the places where they really protested that they should be allowed to continue some of these, some of the projects and the programs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to speak too deeply on matters related to the Arctic Council because, as I say, that's a diplomatic forum. I think the Russians at times have used the promise of engagement, thinking that could entice us to not take the steps that I think are now being taken across the Arctic 7 in terms of building up our deterrence capabilities. So I think it was an appropriate decision to sort of limit the engagement with Russia, of course, as a result of its actions in Ukraine and elsewhere, frankly. So something is clearly lost in that respect. It is unfortunate that the Arctic Council isn't able to continue its important work. But I think we're being clear-eyed about the fact that that cannot be, the Russians cannot sort of hold hostage Arctic Council engagement in the hopes that the rest of the Arctic 7 won't invest in their own defense and deterrence capabilities in the Arctic.
Because this was one of the examples that was always, given that at least in the Arctic Council we can still talk about other important things, but they may have been whitewashing their behavior. So I don't know, I'm not going to try to editorialize on that so much. I will let Masatoshi come in with your perspective. Japan does not declare itself a near Arctic power, a near Arctic state, unlike China. Mm-hmm. So how does it feel to be watching these developments? You have had some quite interesting posts in China, in Taiwan. So you've been very close to Chinese thinking on the Arctic. So I'm really interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Teri, and other colleagues on the stage. And personally, I'm very grateful for FIIA, who is arranging this precious opportunity. And personally, I'm very happy to come back to Finland. I mean, 2 years ago, I was researching at the Finnish university in Tampere University. So that's why I'm very happy right now. And in general, Japan and NATO are advancing our cooperation with each other, especially Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I mean, so Japan is the biggest supporter for Ukraine outside the NATO, and we are financially supporting Ukraine, of course, and we are offering the defense materials as well. So, and mainly because we are having 3 potential adversaries around Japan. So I used to be working within the Japanese government, but anymore, so I have kind of freedom of speech, so I can say that. So,
And if I can just say how remarkable it is that you can sit here and talk about the support that Japan is giving to Ukraine, because when the Ukraine Defense Contact Group was first set up, people didn't want to talk about that, but I had conversations like this with your ambassador last night, and the fact that you can mention it openly. And I mean, this itself is a remarkable change from even 2 years ago, when almost 3 years ago when the war started.
And we are very, very keen to support Ukraine because Ukraine is our neighbor's neighbor. So I mean, so our neighbor is Russia, of course, and neighbor's neighbor is Ukraine. And our northern territory is illegally occupied Russia, of course, northern territories. So, and that's why we are very keen to cooperate with Finland, NATO, and European countries. And we have 3 potential adversaries, namely Russia, China, and North Korea, and 3 are all intimate threat to Japanese security. And that's why we like to cooperate with NATO. And regarding the Arctic, so, to be honest, we started to have our ambassador for Arctic issue from the year 2013, maybe earlier than the US. I'm sorry to say that. But, anyway, so as Teri says, so we are not the Arctic country, but we are observer on the Arctic Council as well. And so we are the closest country geographically to the Arctic. So we have a very large expectations to the Arctic, and if it is governed by the international order, the present international order by the Japan, Europe, and the US, it could be the nice corridor between Japan and the European countries.
Was it annoying when China said it was a near-Arctic state?
Yeah, but anyway, we have very great interest in the Arctic as well, and we'd like to contribute to the stability of the Arctic issue as well as a powerhouse for technology. So everybody knows that, so Japan is a powerhouse for technology. For instance, we are the 3rd largest country in terms of shipbuilding, and maybe we can contribute to the ice breaking as well. So and
you're in the right country now to talk about that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so we can cooperate in many ways, I think.
So I want to give my panelists a chance to come in on anything each other have said before I bring up a new set of questions. Would anybody like to respond to any comments? No, Iro, you started.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking about the Arctic Council. I mean, when it comes to the questions of...
I wouldn't even know about it if I hadn't lived in Finland, to be honest. I wouldn't focus that much on it, but it was important here.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the questions of hard security and military security, I mean, I think it's really important to point out that the Arctic Council never addressed those questions. I mean, they fell outside the jurisdiction of the Arctic Council. The same applied to the Barents Arctic Council as well, which is now suspended as well. So I think the Arctic 7, the Nordic countries, Canada, and the United States really have to take matters in their own hands inside NATO to make sure that we plan the necessary defense posture in the High North without aggravating the situation, but making sure that each inch of our territory, whether it's in the land, sea, or air, or even in cyber and space, is protected. So I'm kind of calling here, for a sort of deterrence by denial posture.
But those things that were taken up, Greg, I mean, what happened to the search and rescue functions that were still working correctly? I mean, are those now a risk, another risk?
I think there's always risk when it comes to operating in the extreme conditions in the Arctic. I think there are still basic norms around coming to the aid of fellow mariners in extremist situations. But I do want to pick up the point that Iro made around the fact that I think the Arctic Council is necessary but not sufficient when it comes to protecting the interests of the Arctic 7. And that work is really underway in terms of what Eero has described, to build those mechanisms to ensure that we are developing the capabilities together as well as the connectivity. The fact that the United States has agreed with Sweden and Finland independently here new defense cooperation agreements that will enable more exercising, more presence, more engagement. I think that that's what we're going to see more and more of. We heard just a few moments ago about the decision about the forward land forces component for which Sweden will be the framework nation. I think this work is happening now day by day, and it is happening really, I think, on a real purposeful basis. I see, Finland's former ambassador to NATO here in the crowd. There's been tremendous work happening in Brussels. The pace of decision making, I think, has been quite impressive in terms of the shift we've seen here when it comes to European security broadly considered, but as well with respect to thinking about the way ahead on Arctic security.
And you mentioned this, Alex, a bit. I mean, we can't talk about the Arctic without talking about the environmental situation. And I just looked up what the latest report was, and NASA just said last week that the sea ice retreated to near historic lows, and they believe it's at its minimum for the year on September 11th, so just within the last couple of weeks. And so this increases dramatically the opportunities for the Russian-Chinese cooperation. I mean, perhaps we wouldn't see, we wouldn't see them scaling up so much if they didn't have these environmental opportunities, which are rising dramatically, aren't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly the navigability of the Northern Sea route is changing. Ice is still it's a variable environment. So certainly the long historic trends are fairly clear. It's still, as has been mentioned, a very difficult place to operate. I think we've seen some of that this year in terms of the shipping. We've had the first full-size container ship go through basically without a hitch from St. Petersburg to China.
Which couldn't have happened, 20 years
And this is
ago?
not an ice-class vessel, exactly. So,
right.
It's already still taking a risk, but it couldn't have happened. I don't really want to put a date on it. A Maersk ship has gone through, I think, close to a decade ago now. The volume is not close. So, we have to always frame this quite carefully. The Panama Canal, the Red Sea, Suez Canal, the Arctic's not about to displace this, in even a 25-year horizon. But the option is there. The Chinese are seizing it. I think one of the important parts is that the Chinese and the Russians are building the capability, whether it's ports, whether it's ships, etc. The Chinese are building their Arctic fluency. We heard Arctic IQ. This gives them that opportunity to operate in the cold. And this isn't just military. Frankly, it's mostly not military at this stage. It's commercial enterprise. So I would really, add my voice to the A7 cooperation point. I think that's absolutely crucial. And maybe one thing to keep in mind is an overall change in the Arctic. It's not just what's changing between China and Russia. It's our perceptions of Russia in the Arctic, irrevocably changed in 2022. The other Arctic states had really bent over backwards, I think, since 2014 to say, this is a different space. We are cordoning it off. We'll continue to work with you. Our interests, trump the other problems that we have. And that just became a non-sustainable position.
Was that a mistake at the time?
Well, I think 2014, we should have taken the lessons more clearly. And I think you've alluded to it already. Talking about it as a zone of peace, etc. The Russians have been building up their military capacity, even if it's defensive. Again, it speaks to their ability to wage war in the Arctic. And have we been doing the same things? I think we're late to that game.
And bringing in China on this. So I was in Kirkenes about a year ago, and the reason that I was initially there was because there was this Nordic expose of how Russia is using its ships, its fishing ships, to actually do a lot of other things, and then to pull into port in Kirkenes and get repaired and this kind of thing. And one of the shocking things I heard, and I think this came out even in the last couple of weeks in controversy in Norway, was that the port the Port Authority in Kirkenes was saying, we want to turn to China. We want this to be open. We're losing business because of Russia, and we're not at war with China. China's not under sanctions. Let's go that direction. So I believe, because I think I talked to Carsten Friis last night, told me that this has now been shut down a bit in Norway, this opportunity. But again, speaking as Japan, and you look at them welcoming, even a country which is as well aware, a NATO country like Norway, saying, come on, China, come on through. I mean, how does that make you feel as Japan, and especially as a China specialist in Japan?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to some comments about the China-Russia. And even after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia is very active around Japan in the Far East. So we conducted the scrambling, so Japanese Air Forces scrambling activity. It was 174 times last year. So, so Russian Air Force is still very active.
Scrambling. You had to scramble 174
against
times.
Russian fighter jets. Yeah.
I don't know what the NATO number is, but they have to do.
And in addition, so Russian-China cooperation around military cooperation around Japan is still very active. So they are jointly operating naval ship around the Japanese archipelago. In addition, they are flying together to the Alaska. It's of course a part of the United States, and so frankly speaking, their cooperation enhancing, and their threats are very intimate to us. And outgoing Stoltenberg, General Secretary, he said when he came to Japan last year, he said, so no NATO partner is closer or more capable than Japan. And I'm very grateful for his kind word. But we are still very capable about that. And so in that mind, we are going to increase our military budget up to the 2% of the GDP. And in my understanding, it's the standard of the NATO standard. And we are going to become the third largest country in terms of the military budget in a few years. So, yeah, that's why.
What percentage of GDP?
2% of GDP.
2%. Oh, in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
All right then.
Teri,
yeah, go ahead.
May I interject just briefly here? I know there's a profound understanding of Russia in this room, but especially for our audience online, I just want to kind of weigh in with a little bit of a corrective, in some sense, to this idea that kind of Russia is this sort of 10-foot tall kind of powerhouse. I think that narrative gets propagated in the media because of the very sort of threatening actions that Russia takes, whether it's with respect to the United States or Japan or the Nordic states that we've described here. And yet, Russia has a remarkable... Yeah, perhaps not just in the media, but Russia has a remarkable capacity for self-sabotage. For so long, they had concerns about the enlargement of NATO, and yet it secured the very future it sought to avoid by its actions in Ukraine. And now Finland and Sweden, Finland, of course, with its massive border with Russia, are now inside of NATO. And so too, we were talking briefly here about what Russia refers to as the Northern Sea Route. I think part of the reason we don't see a more significant uptick in commercial traffic internationally through the quote-unquote Northern Sea Route is because of, again, Russia's threatening posture along the Russian Arctic coastline and the extra legal kinds of requirements it's sought to impose on freedom of navigation along its coastline. It's still in the single digits in terms of any kind of individual states' vessels underway at any given time. Most of the activity we now see in the Russian Arctic is simply Russian tankers moving hydrocarbons down to China. And we should see this not as a kind of great strength, but as the kind of weakness that it is. Russia's activities in the Russian Arctic are predicated on the fact that access to the Arctic and hydrocarbons from the Russian Arctic are one of the very few things Russia can offer to China in exchange for its diplomatic support, its enablement of Russia's actions in Ukraine. So again, I would just underscore that the relationship that Russia has with China right now is a reflection not of its strength, but of its weakness.
Interesting. Yes, and I mean, we did hear that in the morning panel, Henry Foy's very depressing morning panel. There were some reflections of that as well. I want to bring in, did you want to say something? You looked like you might. And I want to bring in questions from the audience.
Yeah,
so
I'm just thinking about Russia's strength and the kind of different, like if you compare Russia with United States or China, near Arctic state, like how that differs. And my understanding is that Russia fundamentally has an Arctic identity, which the other countries, Arctic 7 maybe, and some of the stakeholders don't have. And I'm thinking, where is it coming from? And you know, I think it's a combination of different factors. It's the economic factors. Apparently over 20% of Russia's GDP is extracted from the Arctic region. It has the biggest population living in the Arctic than any of the Arctic countries do, over 2 million people. So it's also protecting the rights of those people in the region. And therefore it wants to posture itself and show that strength in the region. And I think in that sense, I think some of these other Arctic players are still far behind.
Fair enough. Again, Norway, I know in its national security strategy, literally says it needs to keep these very small northern villages populated. That's part of its security strategy, so that it also has legitimate
Absolutely.
concerns and protection. I mean, not just to counter Russia, but in addition to the other reasons why it needs its population up there. But that's one of the reasons why Kirkenes, was a focus, because you need to keep commercial activity alive there, and that was what they centered on. So it's a difficult situation for those communities in the NATO countries, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this is, when we look at the kind of impact that the current situation has, it has a lot of impact on the local communities as well, the indigenous people, and also other local people that live in those areas, and their relationships have actually changed a lot because of Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine.
At the same time, have these countries been too permissive when you talk about Norway allowing the Russian ships that are fishing ships to dock there, to get repaired there? I mean, they're not just fishing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's still activity happening, as we say, yeah.
And still, do we have any questions? I know people, oh wow, I have a lot. Okay, I will take the two at the front table and then the one back there. We have enough time, we have 35 minutes, so we don't have to group questions yet, and I know I have someone else who wants a question. Yes, ma'am, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Johanna Ikävalko. I'm the director of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland, and greetings from Rovaniemi, Finnish Lapland.
Cool.
Yes.
Thanks for coming down.
I have an invitation and I have a question, but before I actually give either, I would just like to shortly tell where I come from or what I represent. The Arctic Center is a research organization that provides comprehensive understanding of the Arctic, also comprehensive understanding of the security of the Arctic. And we study the climate change. Nobody talks about the climate change too much in the media anymore. Have you noticed that? We study the people. We study the people in the Arctic. We study the everyday life in the Arctic, the businesses in the Arctic, livelihoods in the Arctic. And it's good to remember that here in Scandinavia, the Arctic is quite different from what it is in North America, for example, that we have infrastructure in the entire Scandinavian northern areas. Most people have 5G in their phones wherever they go to, and we have healthcare, education, all that. But now, the current discussions, they seem to concentrate very much, I could actually, Alex, ask you this in Finnish.
Do you speak Finnish, Alex?
Yes, he does. He never reveals it. The current discussions, they seem to concentrate on hard security. I mean, when we're talking about the Arctic, they concentrate on hard security, which is understandable, but it's only one part of the security. They concentrate on business opportunities in the north and unused natural resources, and they forget about everything that I just mentioned, especially as people living in the north, not just indigenous, not belittling the indigenous, but there are also locals like myself and many, many others. So, the question is that how much in your work, when you talk about the Arctic IQ, how much in your work do you actually maintain the holistic view of the Arctic? And then the invitation, no matter what you respond, what you reply. The Arctic Center is organizing another Rovaniemi Arctic Spirit Conference in May 2025. And the theme is elements of security. So we are talking about comprehensive, holistic security in the Arctic Spirit in May 2025. And that's in Rovaniemi. Welcome.
Kyllä mä tulen.
Kiitos.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Johanna. And I think, you know, if you actually look at the arc of Arctic studies and security discussions since the late 80s and 90s, the human security, the environmental security, these have been big parts. And what I've noticed working on the field, I mean, it's very hard to talk about even these geostrategic issues without bringing it right back down to the local level. So in the Canadian case, you know, I would say that the majority of Arctic policy, in fact, has been dominated by those questions. If you look at our Arctic and Northern policy framework from 2019, I think it was, you know, really the first, I think, 5 chapters are completely about life in the North, reconciliation, as we call it, you know, so Canada's governments and peoples dealing with, and, you know, dealing with the heritage of colonialism when it comes to the First Nations peoples, and of course then with the Inuit and the other First Nations that live in the far north. So it is very hard to talk about without that. You know, for instance, you find very different stories throughout the Arctic. Like in the Canadian North, there certainly are constituencies within the Inuit community that are very big on dual and multiple use investment in infrastructure. And you're very right to point to the fact that, you know, North American Arctic infrastructure is in many cases, you know, a century behind perhaps. The majority of energy in the Canadian Arctic is generated by diesel generators, right? So if we're talking about climate change and things like that. So, you know, this question, you certainly find quite a bit of keenness to say, okay, if defense investments are going to come in, we may welcome them, you know, into our communities, but we also want to see the, you know, the 5G, the communications, the roads, the water, which is a basic problem in Canada, the service of water to a lot of Indigenous communities. So those questions are never very far away. And I do think in the discussion of geopolitics in general, we always need to remember, you know, it's easy to fall into kind of abstract terms of power. Of course, we're talking about individual people, and about 4 million people, I guess, who live, you know, roughly around the Arctic Circle and north, you know, need to have a say. And it's certainly in Canada's history, maybe I'll just you know, conclude on this, is that, and I think aspects of U.S. engagement in the North American Arctic too, you know, the Inuit and others were largely, I mean, not just ignored, but in fact, adversely affected and had their lifestyle completely altered by being forced into communities, you know, when the radar systems, et cetera, went in. So there is a discussion that, again, we use this framework in Canada of reconciliation where, you know, treaty rights need to be respected. In many cases, you know, the treaty rights, that's a discussion. It's not an either or. It can be a both and, but it's not even just consultation anymore. It's co-involvement, co-management, co-ownership, you know, that you have to have the Indigenous component of any investment from mining. And I would say that's a geoeconomic factor for us, because Canada simply will not be able, and this applies across the whole country, to realize a lot of its natural resource wealth, you know, compete with China on critical minerals, rare earths, without having this powerful, strong internal governance that intimately involves and works with Inuit First Nations communities.
And I recall Justin Trudeau apologizing, didn't he? Apologize to the First Nation?
He has indeed
just in the last couple of years.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's certainly been a centerpiece of his you know, time as Prime Minister, and I think, you know, it's fundamentally changed how, you know, the Conservative Party, you know, we're about to have an election in Canada probably in the next 12 months, maybe sooner. You know, they have a reconciliation policy. Right, so the fabric of discussion on this has changed entirely in the Canadian case. You know, we have many other interesting examples. I mean, Greenland effectively is an Inuit, you know, government within the Kingdom of Denmark. You know, there's the Sami population, the ongoing discussions here. So I think there's quite a few aspects to this, and it's not just local. I mean, I would say that has a geopolitical dimension as well, and that's kind of the back and forth conversation I think that needs to be happening.
Greg and Eero both want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I know we want to get to more questions, but I think this is a really important theme. So first, many thanks for the kind invitation to Arctic Spirits. Yes, we'll have to go.
We'll have to wait.
Book our tickets, I guess, May 2025. But yeah, just want to note up front that our national strategy for the Arctic region obviously puts these issues of climate change in the Arctic front and center, and it's featured quite heavily as well, even in our national defense strategy. Defense capabilities play an important role in terms of monitoring conditions in the Arctic. Both of those documents also have important sections on engagement with indigenous communities and the important role they have to play in terms of security and stability and prosperity, frankly, in the Arctic region, the transpolar Arctic. I will note that even before coming to Stockholm and Helsinki on this trip, I spent something like 10 days traveling around Alaska, having roundtable discussions in far-flung communities to ensure that Alaska Native groups felt like they saw themselves in this new defense strategy for the Arctic and felt like they had an avenue for expressing both their concerns as well as registering opportunities for us to sort of deepen our engagement across Alaska. And this is very much, front and center, of course, in our bilateral dialogue with our Canadian colleagues. And I will note that issues related to the interests of the Sami people and the Lapland region more generally came up in virtually every meeting I had with Finnish counterparts during my visit here. So I think far from being forgotten, these issues are actually remarkably centered even in defense thinking these days. So hopefully that provides you some assurance that these matters are not being forgotten.
And Greg, just quickly, was there a big difference between, I believe this new strategy replaced a 2018 or 2019 one. Did you see a big difference? Like, did you see a greater understanding, a greater recognition? Has there been, a quick, has there been a quick reckoning of perhaps less attention before in the new strategy? Could you see a big difference?
Yeah, I will say in many respects, I think from the 2019 strategy, this strategy is different in kind, not merely in degree. And there's a lot, including the focus on some of these concerns, that is different from the 2019 strategy. The 2019 strategy was in fact a response to a reporting requirement from Congress. This is a much more proactive strategy signed out by the Secretary, and it's going to bear with it a much more kind of active posture, not only about these issues, but of course our defense engagement with the Arctic 7 and NATO around Arctic matters. So yeah, I think this strategy is much more active, and it's a reflection of the fact that while I think even 5 years ago there was still this idea that the Arctic region was somehow exceptional and that contagion from other parts of the world wouldn't affect the Arctic region and that it would somehow be peaceful in perpetuity in this kind of self-perpetuating way. I think we know now, and we are clear-eyed about the fact that it's going to take active engagement, it's going to take investment, resourcing in the Arctic to ensure it does remain a peaceful, stable, and increasingly prosperous region.
You wanted to comment, and deterrence and defense.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, thank you for the question. It's a brilliant question. Obviously, I approach often from the hard security perspective, being a researcher on that regard. But I think you're completely right pointing out that we really need to also address those softer security concerns. We're talking about holistically, when we talk about even total defense or total comprehensive security, two sides of the same coin. And, when you think of the Arctic and the environmental impacts, there are so many issues that we need to address. However, personally, I'm trying to get more engaged. This is not a paid ad, but I'm just pointing out that YLE, the Finnish broadcasting company, for instance, is organizing an event on security. This November, I'm going to be speaking there and hopefully engaging, and I will be engaging with the local people as well, because this is something really important. And you said about the DCA. I was actually speaking in an event this summer, and somebody asked me there, how have the indigenous people's rights, the Sami people's rights, been taken into account in preparation of this agreement? And well, I wasn't speaking on the government's behalf, but I had studied that agreement and the proposal, and I couldn't say.
Exactly, I was just going to say, I have no idea.
So I think this is something that we need to learn from the Canadian and American allies, yeah.
But the DCA was so uncontroversial in Finland compared to Sweden. Yeah. I'm sure that the Swedish government was criticized for this, and we probably could learn from their discussion on this, because that was really hotly debated there. And Masatoshi, you wanted to say something, and then we'll...
Yeah, just briefly, but I'm very happy to hear from Lapland, and I really enjoyed my trip to Lapland 2 years ago, and I'd like to say that there is an outstanding cooperation between your university and Hokkaido University in Japan, and research collaboration. And I'd like to echo with the previous comment. I mean, you mentioned freedom of navigation. So as a member of G7, Japan, alongside with Canada and the US, Japan is putting a much barrier on the freedom of navigation, and it must be adapted in the Arctic as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, General Hodges? Oh, and then there's my Bering Strait question I was looking for.
Ben Hodges. My question is to Director Pollock. And by the way, thank you for the clarification about Russian vulnerabilities in the north, which Teri dismissed as interesting, but I thought it was a very clear and strong statement. My question to you is about Iceland and Svalbard. It feels like our presence in Iceland is growing again, more capacity there, but what about Chinese presence there, diplomatic, economic, scientific in Iceland? And then Svalbard, of course, part of our Norwegian, belongs to our Norwegian allies, but what's our interest watching what Russia is doing in Svalbard?
Yeah, so first, General Hodges, just want to thank you for your leadership, both in uniform and now out of uniform. You've been a strong and passionate advocate, I think, for our engagement in Ukraine, and I really want to associate myself with your remark yesterday that nobody has the right to be fatigued besides the Ukrainian people. So just wanted to kind of thank you for that. So on Iceland and Svalbard, Iceland, it is, I think, somewhat unfortunate that, as you know, the U.S. military kind of retrograded from Keflavik some years ago. This is, as ever, kind of a reflection of competing global interests and the constant kind of challenges of making our resources, our means stretch across all of our respective global commitments. But the engagement with Iceland is growing increasingly robust. As you know, Iceland doesn't have a full-blown military, but nonetheless, we have strong engagement with them. In fact, we've established recently an Arctic security policy roundtable to kind of complement the work happening through the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, as well as the Arctic CHODs, which are meeting here in Reykjavik for long. Reykjavik will also be hosting our next Arctic Security Policy Roundtable. So this is a testament to, I think, Iceland's kind of keen engagement on the security issues with the United States, and they're obviously an important part of the Arctic 7, and they have critical geography. One kind of key theme in all of my meetings, both in Stockholm and here in Helsinki, is the degree to which Northern Europe has kind of become this sort of unified theater. Once upon a time, I think we thought about the Baltics over here, the Arctic over there, the GI-UK gap over there. I think more and more we're seeing through fora like our Arctic fora, as well as through the Nord-Balts format and others, we're seeing more integration and coherence in terms of our posture, our presence, are exercising across that wider region. So Iceland's going to be a key player here moving forward. Svalbard, as you know, is a kind of complex, has a complex history associated with it. I think the Norwegians are clear-eyed about the risks in terms of foreign activity in Svalbard, and I think that's a pattern that we're seeing across the region here, both with respect to Russia, and I think to a real meaningful degree, we're seeing an uptick in concern and skepticism about Chinese intentions. The Chinese have been knocking on doors across the Arctic for a number of years now.
Dropping anchors in unusual places.
Yeah, and they've tried to make a push in various places, particularly in Greenland at one point. And I think this gets to the point that Eero made about Arctic literacy. I think there's a growing understanding that China's intentions in the Arctic may not really align with those of the West. When it comes to the kind of Russian activity in Svalbard, obviously that's something that's a kind of constant irritant diplomatically to the Norwegians as well. But I'm pretty confident in Norway's ability to continue monitoring that activity and take the necessary precautions. Of course, Norway has been in NATO for a very long time. And they're a terrific kind of ally, and I think now that we have the clarity across the Nordic states working together, that's only going to enhance information sharing and the ability to prevent undue influence in places like Svalbard and elsewhere.
Okay, I'm going to take the question from the back. Someone had, okay, and then I'll come back here to the front.
Thank you very much.
fascinating to follow this discussion on the Arctic and the Arctic Council.
And could you introduce yourself, please?
Being my country's representative in the Arctic Council.
Sorry, great.
I'm Finland's Arctic ambassador.
Fantastic.
2 points. I think it would be useful always to take a step back and note that the Arctic is not from the Arctic Ocean to the Baltic Sea. It's from Vancouver to Vladivostok, including the Central Arctic Ocean and the North Pole. 40% of Canada is Arctic. 100% of Finland is Arctic on the basis of our own national Arctic strategy. So maintaining the comprehensive picture of the circumpolar Arctic is very important. And I submit 2 clarifications with regard to the reflections that the distinguished panelists put forward. One is that Russia has not been suspended from the Arctic Council. Russia continues to be a member in the Arctic Council. Admittedly, we are far from business as usual, but certain work is being taken forward. And thank you very much to the skills of the Norwegian chairship. And we look forward to the Kingdom of Denmark assuming the chairship next May. The Arctic Council is and continues to be of importance. The second clarification I'd like to submit is that I often hear the phrase that the Arctic Council does not deal with security issues. In fact, what the Ottawa Declaration from '96 says is that the Arctic Council shall not address issues pertaining to military security. But there are a whole range of issues related to food, health, environment, and human security that the Council does address. We have a working group on emergency prevention, preparedness and response. We have a legally binding agreement on search and rescue, which even has an expert group addressing issues pertaining to radiation risks. We have the Arctic Coast Guard Forum. We have the University of the Arctic Network, which brings together 200 universities in 14 countries that address issues within 60 thematic networks. Many of these address aspects of security.
Ambassador, if I might, I didn't understand that the Arctic Council had suspended Russia, but that it had suspended its normal meetings for the time being. Is that not correct?
If I was there, I could provide a full account of what the decisions that were taken in the context of the Arctic Council since February of 22 and where we currently are. I don't think I have time or luxury to do that.
No, we've
now.
only got 15
Virtual
minutes.
Meetings at low expert level take place.
Okay.
It takes a few more words to explain that, but it has not been suspended. That's the point.
Okay. I checked that this morning, and then I must have read something that wasn't correct. I didn't understand that they had suspended Russia, though, surprisingly. Okay, that's not a question, but thank you for your clarifications. And we have another question here at the front.
Thank you, Jan Willem Röper, Germany. My question is not regarding Bering Strait. My question is, my question is regarding the Arctic 7. We talk so normally about Arctic 7, and there's someone else. There's Russia, and there's going a lot on when Russia, they approaching Faroe Islands, for example, the fishing grounds over there. We saw them in Svalbard. I don't like to continue because you did a fabulous job explaining us what's going on there. And we see the Chinese doing a lot of things, or try to do a lot of things, for example, in Greenland. So my question is, do we already have an ice curtain, or do we or not? I would really help me, please enlighten me. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I don't mind taking a shot
Okay.
at that as my microphone's still working there. An ice curtain is an interesting formulation. We're always looking for good metaphors for this. I think even going back to the Finnish ambassador's comments, I mean, obviously, the situation on diplomacy is very complicated with, frankly, I hear a lot of different statements about how functional the Arctic Council is depending on perspectives.
Thanks.
The issue of China's interests, I mean, have not gone away. I mean, just as every country, I think, is facing, the universities, the research, the questions of where can you, de-risking what is left if you de-risk versus decoupling, what's that gray space in between. I think in the case of a place like Greenland, we've largely seen the Chinese fail and be excluded, but they're a factor, right? And just because some mining investments, some airport investments have been, thwarted, doesn't mean they're going to stop and never come back, right? So I think this question of, the communities, the Faroe Islands, places that depend on single resources, that don't have the luxury of choice, they don't have multiple FDI flows, just as China operates in the Pacific Ocean, it has the option for investment. And, Canadian North, it's not much different. At one time, Alaska was actually quite forward on its China policy. So, again, some of the Danish researchers have talked about this as kind of a wait and see approach. I think the conditions for China to have any significant involvement, it was mentioned, I mean, if you look at all the Nordic security services, they talk about China as a risk for technology. Some are quite specific about threat to the high north. China finds it a difficult environment to operate in. I mean, mining investments are a big deal, a lot of money up front. If they fall apart, it's a lot of wasted time and potentially a massive hit to your bottom line. But the persistence, I think, is an issue. It was said earlier about Russia in one of the earlier panels. These aren't issues that are just going to be solved. I mean, the Arctic is a part of the world, and it has needs, many, the capital, et cetera, that's required to develop it, to deal with issues like climate change come from the outside, and the Chinese are very willing to offer that. So we need to think hard about geoeconomics and the sort of offer, and I think the EU, again, to use the Greenland example, both the EU and the United States have attempted to put good offers on the table so that Greenland can say, yeah, we can continue to develop our economy without the Chinese. But right now, something like 98% of Greenland's earnings come from selling fish, and over 50% of those, if I recall, go to China. So it's, they're there.
That's big.
Really briefly here. So Russia is, of course, an important Arctic state. It is the largest Arctic state. It has legitimate interests, both economic and security, in the Arctic. I think we grant all of that. That said, to the extent that it wants to engage on Arctic matters or on other issues, it needs to change its policies, and the onus is on Russia to end its brutal further occupation of Ukraine. That's step one. Until those actions are kind of underway, I don't really see how we can engage the Russian Federation on parts of the world where there are these kinds of, whether it's shared or competing interests. That said, I will just note that times change, and in sort of strategic time, I think here about the fact that a U.S. representative is up here on a panel with a Japanese representative talking about Arctic security. There are various parts of that sentence that would have been unthinkable, a few decades in the rearview mirror. And so times do change, and that we, look forward to the time when engagement with the Russian Federation on, constructive shared interest is possible once again. But we are extraordinarily far from that point right now, as various other speakers and other panels have underscored through the course of this forum.
Can I just come in very quickly on that point, because I wanted to get to it about Japan and others. I mean, the Arctic for Canada kind of extremely, and I think for the United States, for a long time was a very exclusive North American issue under the NORAD construction of aerospace defense that evolved a little bit over time to have more of a maritime, but it still remains an aerospace function. Canada, has historically been very, very cautious about how it engages non-Arctic states, in the region. Our newest defense strategy actually puts that aside, endorses northern flank. I mean, things that would have been quite unthinkable, I think, before 2022. It was always a bit of an issue, but how we, approached the North in a NATO framework. I think some of it, certainly if you look at Canadian strategy, and I sense this in the US DoD as well, that the idea that, partnerships, that this isn't just an exclusive space. The A7, as was said, if Russia wants to change how it behaves internationally, comes back in, will still set a lot of the terms for what sort of engagement and involvement, but the opportunities for Germany, the opportunities for Japan, the opportunities for the NATO alliance in general, I think are much bigger. And the potential is there for creativity. And we've seen some of that, for instance, with the trilateral letter of intent between Canada, Norway, and Germany on maritime security in the North Atlantic. We're seeing ways that if you're outside of the region, you can get involved, and that's a change among how we're thinking about, Arctic.
Reflected in NATO as well, in its increasing
Absolutely.
cooperation with Indo-European. And Masatoshi, you wanted to say something,
Yeah.
and then I'll take two questions together. We're not going to have. We only have 8 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, and I'd like to agree with the Finnish ambassador, and the discussion should be comprehensive. And I'd like to add the infrastructure that was discussed on the stage yesterday. And Japan is very active contributor about infrastructure in Asia as well. So about the high loads airport and ports, and it could be a potential contribution from Japan as well in the Arctic. Yeah.
Okay. All right. This lady and behind you. I'll take those two together, and we'll have very short. We'll need to have quite short answers here. It's very, Ben, I remember you saying yesterday how hard it is to see from here. It's very hard, so I apologize.
Hello, my name is
Wendy.
Amelia. I'm with the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I wanted to pick up on Alex's point there on cooperation and different opportunities, because of course the Warsaw format exists as a place for observer states and the European Union to meet annually, meet with the chairpersonship and talk about working groups. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask whether there were any opportunities to formalize the Warsaw format and that cooperation and be able to take some of the conversations from that, very frank conversations that exist among the observer states, take those forward into the Arctic Council, sort of bearing in mind what the ambassador mentioned with this very broad consideration of security. Thank you.
Okay, and a question behind you.
My name is Fredrik Löjdqvist. I'm director of the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. The title of this session is Securing the Arctic, and I'm still not quite sure what exactly we're securing. I would propose one interest that we have in securing the Arctic, and that is upholding international law, which Russia clearly is challenging in terms of how it's defined territory and economic zones and so forth, and freedom of navigation. Normally, it seems that Russia is having an initiative and we're reacting, but in the Arctic, I'm not even sure that we're even reacting. How can we sort of address this challenge? And clearly, military security is back, and if the Arctic Council is not the forum to discuss those, where do we discuss military security in the Arctic?
Okay, I mean, I think those are both questions that can, especially the last one, can provide a good basis for concluding remarks from each of the speakers as well. And I mean, talking about whether there's any choice but to increasingly militarize in the Arctic under the current conditions with Russia, I mean, I think also is a look forward. So, Iro, I will start with you. And again, we have 5 minutes, so it will be your concluding remarks.
Yes,
as well.
thank you so much. I'm kind of tying with the previous question we had in the previous round. I think there is ice curtain currently, and there will be ice curtain as long as the war in Ukraine continues. And once that melts, that curtain will come down. But it will take time. And this brings to the next point that we need to form an strongly cooperate with the countries who share the same norms and values with us within the rules-based international order, within the Arctic 7, the Arctic stakeholders like the IP4 countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan. So I think this is really important. Upholding the kind of format of fora that we could have for military security in the Arctic, as far as I see, there's only one, that's NATO. Why take it anywhere else? We have NATO's new DDA at place. We have NATO's new regional plans at place. We do all the military exercises, command control, increasing Arctic capabilities. Maybe one day in NATO we will see actually Arctic capabilities. There will be a snowflake next to a capability requirement in NATO's defense planning process.
Well, there are new regional plans, and we don't know exactly what's in them. But
so yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, so I think I delineated earlier some of the fora that we're currently engaging in terms of Arctic security, but want to associate myself with Iro's remark that, first and foremost, it's going to be NATO. That's really going to be the sort of top of the list in terms of thinking about Arctic security matters. Whether there will be more NATO in Arctic remains to be seen, but now with Finland and Sweden, there is, by definition, more Arctic in NATO, and I think that's a positive development. Obviously, Finland and Sweden bring tremendous Arctic capabilities and defense capabilities writ large, but there are other bodies that will feed into the dialogue that happens, within Brussels. I mentioned some of our Arctic 7 mechanisms, in particular, our emerging Arctic Security Policy Roundtable. Our next, I think, engagement will be convened by the Norwegians, and then in person in Iceland here before long. We've got the Arctic CHODs, of course, ongoing. Next meeting in the Chiefs of Defense meeting in Reykjavik. I think that's an important bit of connective tissue. And then the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, which extends beyond the Arctic 7 and gets to some of these issues of partnership beyond the Arctic states. I also think I mentioned the Nordic defense cooperation mechanisms. And then finally, of course, there's still tremendous amounts of bilateral engagement across the Arctic 7 and beyond. I do want to kind of put one footnote on all of that, that while our strategy underscores the importance and value of expanding engagement and partnership on Arctic security beyond the A7, there are certain sovereign rights and responsibilities when it comes to the Arctic. And I think the Arctic 7 are going to protect those, both as individual nation states as well as a group of Arctic nations. I think there are intentions by some to try to create a narrative that the Arctic is a kind of global commons and that the Arctic should be internationalized. And I think that's a conception that we would have real concerns about and need to guard against. So there's an important balance to be struck here.
So you won't be inviting Indo-European CHODs to the Arctic CHODs meeting?
Not at this time.
Interesting. Okay.
Alex? We talk about the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic, is an ocean and then a lot of recognized territory for sovereign countries. So in a sense, like a lot of the structure is there. The Antarctic, completely different story. To add that, in terms of international law, Canada has competing or, likely be shown to have competing continental shelf claims in the Arctic Ocean with both the Russian Federation and potentially with the Kingdom of Denmark. Canada and the United States have just struck a committee to resolve our ongoing border marine delimitation issues in the Beaufort Sea. So international law is still playing a large role. I think most people say that the Russians will still, use international law there. I'd be inclined to agree. But, when we talk international law with the Russians, they need to know that we're serious about security of this region ourselves and we've taken the appropriate measures. Militarization of the Arctic, I think, is a careful word we have to be careful about. We have every right to put our militaries there and strengthen them. If you look at the details of pretty much what all, certainly Canada and the United States and most of the others, it's about awareness. It's about, creating the awareness in the region about what's going on. That's backed up by capabilities, but a lot of it is understanding better the space. And again, that's a completely consistent point with international law and any understanding of sovereignty. Maybe a final point on getting involved. This is a big question, I think. Countries like Japan have three adversaries right next door, but are large countries that can contribute. South Korea is another one. Germany, France, the UK are clear countries that can be involved. For a country like Poland, I think there'd be opportunities to learn, but of course Poland probably has to anchor the Eastern Front. So I think these are the conversations that need to continue about, creatively, where does this meet our interests? It's not just getting involved with the Arctic for getting involved with the Arctic. The A7, I think, should lead those discussions, but I think there's more creative opportunity. I'll leave it there.
Sorry, I meant to say Indo-Pacific, not Indo-European, but I'm wondering then, is what you've heard here today as Japan, is this reassuring enough for you? You won't be included in all Arctic configurations, but certainly more than would have happened, and perhaps even Russia's war on Ukraine has increased the opportunities for Japan. But are these some ideas that reassure Japan that China and Russia are not going to be able to just completely take over this area and your interests there?
First of all, I'd like to resonate with Alex. International law and especially the UNCLOS is very vital to Japan as a maritime nation. And in addition, I'd like to, as Ira said, as a member of IP4, we'd like to enhance our cooperation with the NATO. And
I tried to get you invited to the Arctic Chods, but
yeah. And we are very still interested in hosting a liaison office in Tokyo. So I'm not sure about the internal discussion within the NATO, but anyway, we'd like to host it. And in addition, we are going to increase our military budget, but it's actually we are a military power. So a lot of people regard Japan as the soft power, something like the manga or sushi. But it's reality that we are still a military power as well. So and on your side, not on the other side. So we'd like to suggest you to utilize Japanese power. So, especially for the European security. Thank you.
I would have liked us to be able to go into also what happens after the next US elections. Let's hope that this strategy stays online after November, whatever, actually after January. I mean, there's a lot of potential concern about what could happen with the progress that's been made on this, but we didn't have time. But I now need to wrap up our panel. Thank you very much to FIIA for having me again back, always a pleasure, and our panelists here. And to all of you, I mean, we have a full room. For those of you online who can't see, we have a full room here and lots of engagement, and that's really a compliment to you, FIIA, and it makes it much more enjoyable for us. And now I am going to hand this over to Mikko to wrap up HSF 2024. Thank you so much to everyone here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guess we will exit right.
That was lovely.
Thank you. Thanks. Wow. These past 3 days have been pretty intense, and as Teri just said, we still have most of the people actually in the room, which is pretty incredible after such an intense 3 days of debate. Unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end, as you know. Although I'm a bit partial, I guess, to this, I would say that this year's Helsinki Security Forum has, if possible, been even better than the previous 2 editions. And this would not have been possible without the support of our partners and our sponsors, which there are many more than there have been in the past 2 editions. We have the partners that we have had previously, the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have the Finnish Ministry of Defense, who supported the forum, the City of Helsinki, and Mayor Juhana Vartiainen. We have, in addition, also some corporate sponsors. We have Patria, Fortum, Lockheed Martin, IQM, and also the Hybrid Center of Excellence. So please give our partners and sponsors a big hand of applause. Thank you. And you have been a great and very engaged audience with lots of excellent questions. So I think this is the right time also for you to thank yourself and for me to thank you. Thank you very much for being around and asking so many good questions. Now, at FIIA, we often say that we have a very special FIIA spirit. Many of us are long-timers who have been in the house many times for very many years, or come back to FIIA. And it's a bit hard to say why we have this great spirit, but for as long as I can remember, at least since the 90s, it's been there. And I think that some of this FIIA spirit has actually rubbed off also on the Helsinki Security Forum. There's something special about the debates we have here. Even though the issues that we debate are often serious, sometimes even grim, we still manage to talk about them in a spirit of collegial and mutually respectful manner, which is actually quite a feat in these days that are so divisive in international politics. And President Stubb, during the first day, his interview with Henry Foy, I think was very much sort of setting the tone for this year's Helsinki Security Forum in this very pleasant kind of talking about some very serious issues. And of course, off stage as well, we have had many good encounters, good debates. I've learned a lot during these days. I hope many of you have as well. And we have also, of course, gotten to know each other better during these days. So I hope that many of you will be back again in next year's Helsinki Security Forum, 4th edition. Now, anyone who has ever worked on organizing a large conference knows that there's a lot of work that goes into something like this. A lot of the work is invisible. You don't notice it. And in fact, many of the best arranged conferences are the ones where you don't really notice the arrangements because everything just flows smoothly and everything just works. And I think this has been also something that in all 3 editions of Helsinki Security Forum has been there. It's just worked, and it's kind of become a signature feature of a conference. And I think that's very fitting, actually, for a conference that has debated a whole of society approach to security, where every part sort of fits together and works well together. So on this note, I would like to conclude the official part of a Helsinki Security Forum. Thank you all once again, and hope to see you again next year. Thank you.